at the United Nations Security Council. Moreover, we moved legislation that ensures that the United States does not do business with institutions and entities that utilized forced labor in China. In doing so, we have demonstrated that defending human rights is a bipartisan priority. This body will continue to shed light on human rights violations, no matter the country involved, be it friend or foe. The United States has also taken action to hold accountable the government of the People's Republic of China for these atrocities and to punish those responsible for these detestable human rights violations. The Biden administration has implemented targeted sanctions against Chinese government officials over their continued human rights abuses in the Uyghur region. We must continue to work with our partners and allies in leading a coordinated effort against what is happening in the Uyghur region of China. We must send a clear message to urge the international community to stand united in condemning the horrific treatment of China's ethnic minorities. We also must put pressure on China to abide by its commitments as a signatory to the Genocide Convention and provide human rights monitors, researchers, and journalists unrestricted access to report on what is happening in the Uyghur region. And this should be done free from any interference. I now recognize the ranking member McCall of Texas for his opening remarks and praise him for working together to push this hearing today. Mr. McCall, you're now recognized for remarks.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you for working with me on the resolution and just on this very important issue. I think the eyes of the world are watching, and certainly the Communist Party of China is watching as we speak. The genocide against the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party is a moral test of our time. There are a few other issues that demand this level of attention, not just from our own committee, but from the world. Elevating this issue is one of the key recommendations made by the China task force that I chaired, so I'm grateful that we can give it the bipartisan attention that it deserves. I'm also grateful, Mr. Chairman, that you joined with me to introduce and pass a resolution condemning this genocide and calling for action. When our resolution passes the House, it will ensure we are speaking in a united voice with the current and prior administrations by calling these ongoing atrocities genocide. Continuing this bipartisan effort will be essential as we respond to this crisis, and I thank you for being my partner on this issue. Genocide is a term that we reserve for history's most serious crimes against humanity. It is essential we get our response right, not as Republicans and Democrats, but as Americans, because we've faced this test before and we've always passed that test. Our response to the Uyghur genocide should be an example of our character rather than a stain on our history. This humanitarian crisis is about more than just U.S. foreign policy towards the People's Republic of China. It is about the legitimacy of the post-World War system designed to stop these atrocities whenever and wherever they are being committed. It is about how we stop the CCP from contaminating consumer supply chains with slave labor. It's about how we stop using cotton sourced from the Uyghur homeland and picked by those without a voice. And it is about how we convince our private sector to act consistently with American values after they developed a reliance on the PRC's consumer market over the last 40 years, and as the United States attempted to bring China into the family of nations, but failed. That's why I'm disappointed our minority witness declined our invitation to join us this afternoon. I did invite Nike Incorporated, an American company that's now struggling with the moral challenge many American companies face. Some analysts have claimed that Nike's supply chain is tainted by forced labor in China. Nike has publicly denied they source from the Uyghur areas and have denied Uyghur forced labor exists in their factories. Simply taking a stand against forced labor has exposed them to a massive boycott effort led by the CCP's online mouthpieces. However, we can assume that part of their decision process may have been likely the backlash from the CCP. And on the other end of the spectrum is Disney, which actually thanked the CCP propaganda office responsible for covering up the Uyghur genocide. And in the end, credits in one of their most recent films, Mulan. And they actually filmed portions of the movie in the Xinjiang province. We cannot put profits ahead of doing what's right. And the American people need to hear from these companies doing business with the CCP, whether they're household names or who is just trying to do the right thing, or they're companies who shamelessly do the bidding of the CCP to maintain their market asset access, no matter what the moral cost is. The true nature of these Faustian deals need to come to light so consumers can begin to know where their money is going. And even though Nike has declined to join us today, we're still honored to be joined by an excellent panel of witnesses who use their voices to stand up for Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minorities who are persecuted by the CCP. So I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your hard work in this effort, and thank you so much for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you for your hard work in putting this together. It was a pleasure joining you on this important act and moving forward, standing up to show the true values of America. Thank you. I'd now like to recognize the Army Bearer, who is the chair of the Subcommittee on Asia and Pacific and Central Asia and Non-Proliferation, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member. Again, this is another area where this is not a partisan issue. You know, Democrats and Republicans coming together, and all of us in Congress, to speak with moral clarity on the importance in the 21st century that we can't let atrocities like what's happening to the Uyghur population occur in a vacuum. And we have to draw attention to this. So I'm quite pleased that the leadership that both of you have shown and the leadership that Congress has shown together. We now have to work with the rest of the world, our partners in the European Union, other like-minded nations, to elevate this conversation. We also have to work with the Islamic majority countries to highlight the atrocities so that the public in those countries understand what's happening to the Uyghur culture, their religion, and atrocities. So I look forward to working with both of you, the full committee, my partner, the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, to address these issues and move them forward. So thank you again for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Bearer. I now recognize the subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as the ranking member of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee and past chair of that committee, I've been following the Chinese Communist Party and what they're up to very closely for many years now. And the barbaric repression that they're committing against the Uyghurs is truly horrific and despicable. Words really don't do justice to the crimes that the whole world are witnessing today. Last month, we passed a resolution introduced by Ranking Member McCall and yourself, Mr. Chairman, calling the atrocities what they are, genocide, forced sterilization, involuntary marriage, family separations are the order of the day there. This hearing is particularly important because the CCP routinely attempts to cover up its malevolent actions. We must take every opportunity to draw attention to the murders, the countless rapes, the brutal torture, and the Orwellian surveillance of innocent Uyghur civilians. Unless we use our power to draw attention to these and countless other atrocities, and then hold their perpetrators accountable, no one else will. So thank you for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Ms. Tusinai Ziyawudun, who is here interpreter, Dr. Elise Anderson. Ms. Tusinai is a survivor of the Chinese government's extra-legal arbitrary detention centers in the Uyghur region and an outspoken advocate for Uyghur human rights. In November 2016, she was detained for more than a year in total in 2 different camps. She was released from the camps in December of 2018 and was granted special parole to enter the United States in September of 2020. As one of the very few survivors of the camps who has reached safety in another country, she has provided testimony to human rights groups, researchers, and journalists investigating the Chinese government's crimes against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim peoples. Next, we have Dr. James A. Millward, who is a professor of intersocietal history at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also teaches at the East Asia program at the University of Granada in Spain. Throughout his career, Dr. Millward has specialized in the Quick Empire, the Silk Road, Eurasian loots and music and history, historical and contemporary Xinjiang, Uyghurs and other Xinjiang indigenous peoples, and PRC ethnicity policy. The Honorable Nure Turkle is the chair of the board of directors at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. As the first US educated Uyghur American lawyer, he's a foreign policy expert and human rights advocate. He was born in a re-education camp at the height of China's tumultuous cultural revolution and spent the first several months of his life in detention with his mother. He came to the United States in 1995 as a student and was later granted asylum by the US government. Without objection, all witnesses' prepared testimony will be made part of the record. And I would now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each to summarize their testimony. So first I go and yield to Ms. Tursunay Ziyawudun. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Tursunay, özünüzni tanıştırın.
Assalamu alaikum hamama. Sizden salam. Ben Tursunay Zeynal'dım. Vatanımız Şarkı Türkistan'ın Olca şehri Künes Naye'den bolma. Ben Künes Naye'na ki Xitay hükümetinin ceza lagerinde yatkan şahit boluş sütüm bilen peşimde tutmayı düzletmekçi. Muşu mening beşimden ötken vaqani so'zlab berishga fursat bergan Amerika hukumatiga rahmat. O'sha kishilarning hammasiga rahmat aytmayman chin qalbimdan. Lekin men o'zimning ingliz tilim bo'lmaganligi uchun men uchun Ilis xonim mening beshimdan o'tganlarimni sizlarga o'qib bermoqchi. Rahmat.
Hello to all of you. My name is Tursunay Ziyawudun. I am from Künes County, Olca City, East Turkestan. I am speaking to you today as a survivor who spent time in a concentration camp in Künes. Thank you to the US government for giving me this opportunity to tell you about my experience. I thank all of you. Because I do not know English, Ms. Elise is going to tell you about what happened to me. I feel that I must speak up as a survivor for all those who have not survived. I'm not asking for sympathy for myself. I am asking governments around the world to wake up. The world should not allow genocide to continue in the 21st century. I grew up in East Turkestan. My husband and I moved to Kazakhstan in 2010. The Kazakhstan government granted residency to my husband, who is of Kazakh ethnicity, but my application was rejected. Because my Chinese passport was expiring, I returned to my hometown in November 2016. Border officials questioned me. Why did I go to Kazakhstan? Had I been in contact with anyone from the US? 1 month later, the authorities confiscated our passports, and a few months after that, I was sent to a camp. The conditions were terrible and filthy. We were told we had problems with our ideology and would receive education. If we asked questions, we were beaten. Because of my health condition, I was released after around 1 month. The second time I was sent to a camp was far worse. It has left an unforgettable scar on my heart. I was taken on March 8th, 2018, and kept there for more than 10 months. Buses would arrive every day with more detainees. It was very overcrowded. There was a bucket in the corner for a toilet. There were cameras watching us inside the cell, and we were always hungry. Each meal was a watery soup and a bun. We were given injections of unknown medications. Every day, we had to endlessly swear loyalty to the Chinese government and reject our faith. We had to watch endless videos about Xi Jinping. Girls would be taken away and only brought back days later. I saw girls lose their sanity because of it. And then I myself was taken, along with another woman. I was tortured with an electric stick pushed inside my genital tract. I could hear the other woman's screams in the next room. I knew the guards were raping her. After that, she never stopped crying. One time an order came. All the women had to be sterilized or fitted with an IUD. Many young women were crying, screaming when they were told they would be sterilized and could never have children. I left the camp in December 2018. Before my release, the officials warned me if I spoke about my experience, there would be heavy consequences. I still did not feel free. One day I saw a former cellmate. She had survived, but she was dead inside, completely finished by the rapes. The government's goal is to destroy everyone, and everybody knows it. In September 2019, I was allowed to leave for Kazakhstan. I told my story to a Kazakh human rights group and to journalists, but I was still afraid of the Chinese government. There was a suspicious fire at our house, and the Chinese police would call me and threaten me. It was only after I came to the US last year that I decided I could tell the full story of what happened to me. I knew that I might not be believed. I knew that some people would consider that my honor was tarnished. But with the support of my husband, I took my courage in my hands and told the truth to BBC reporters. The story was aired on February 2nd. The story sent a shockwave around the world. But Uyghurs and Kazakhs thanked me for speaking out. They couldn't stop their tears as they thought about their sisters and daughters and what they might be suffering. We cried together. The Chinese government reacted by smearing me and the other survivors who testified about sexual abuse, even a culture of rape in the camps. At a press conference in Beijing, the foreign ministry spokesman held up my photo and called me a liar. I want to thank the United States for giving me safe haven. Without your help, I would still be a stateless refugee, still fearing that the Chinese government could force me back to China. Now you have my testimony. I ask you to take action. Thank you.
Thank you for that testimony. I now turn to James Millwood. You're now recognized for 5 minutes, Dr. Millwood. Dr. Millwood, you may have to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Chairman Meeks, Ranking Member McCall, and distinguished members of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, thank you for inviting me to testify about this critical issue. I would like to mention at the outset that insofar as I have any expertise to offer, acquiring it has been generously supported by Title VI, Fulbright Hays, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and by the University of Arizona, where I taught in the early 1990s. Federal and state public funding has been and remains critical to building and maintaining US knowledge about China. When it came to power and took control of Xinjiang in 1949, the PRC found itself ruling over the diverse peoples of a former empire, the Qing Empire. Like the Soviet Union, another socialist state controlling a former empire, for the Han-dominated Chinese Communist Party to exercise power over indigenous peoples in Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, and elsewhere, presented both a practical and an image problem. how to rule over a former empire without being an imperialist or looking like a colonialist yourself. The PRC thus implemented a modified version of the Soviet nationalities policies, recognizing 56 ethnic groups, including the Han. It also created so-called autonomous regions, including the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and many so-called autonomous prefectures and counties. The officially recognized ethnic groups and supposedly self-governing ethnic territorial units comprised what we may call the PRC's diversity management system. Now, this original diversity management system supported language, education, and cultural expression of each non-Han group. In theory, and at times in practice, it protected non-Han groups from discrimination and cultural erasure by the Han majority, and assured each official ethnic group some representation within the authoritarian government and party. While very different from the diversity management systems of liberal democracies, this first-generation PRC diversity system, when honestly implemented, proved popular among non-Han people. One might even say that in the 1950s, non-Han people in China were, as regards racial discrimination and violence, better off than blacks and other persons of color in Jim Crow America. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s was a horrific exception, but non-Han groups in the PRC look back to the 1980s as a relative golden age of PRC diversity policies. Since 2013, however, General Secretary Xi Jinping has embarked on a radical revision of the PRC diversity system. He has moved the bureaucracies dealing with ethnicity and religion out of the government and under the direct control of the party's United Front Department. He announced in 2014 that problems in Xinjiang would require attention not just to material measures, that is, economic development, but also to psychological issues, a framing that led to the program of so-called concentrated educational transformation in prison-like facilities for over 1 million people and the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands more. He also launched a campaign to Sinicize religion in China. Xi Jinping promotes an idealized, homogeneous Chinese identity labeled Zhonghua as a centerpiece of his China dream. A current Chinese political catchphrase calls on the party to grasp firmly the forging of a Zhonghua collective consciousness as the main political line. This notion of Zhonghua is meant to be a kind of super ethnicity encompassing all the others, but the word Zhonghua itself is composed of 2 Chinese characters that each individually mean Chinese. And in practice, the characteristics of Zhonghua are indistinguishable from those of Han. This state promotion of Zhonghua identity, then, is a top-down effort to Hanize or Sinicize non-Han ethnic groups in China. The phrase forging collective Zhonghua consciousness reminds us of a metaphor we now seldom use in the United States, the melting pot. The Chinese Communist Party, however, substitutes for the melting pot a blast furnace directed at the indigenous peoples of Xinjiang. This industrial strength metaphor, chosen by the party itself, aptly sums up the physical coercion and cultural violence of the concrete policies inflicted upon Xinjiang indigenous peoples since 2017, which has been well documented in the work of numerous researchers, journalists, and US government investigations. My colleague, Nuri Turkel, will present several recommendations, which I'll just simply say that I endorse. And to end, finally, let me say that further targeted sanctions and shaming of responsible parties are warranted and should be undertaken in collaboration with other nations. It is crucial, however, that we pursue these efforts without indulging in broad brush demonization of China or Chinese people generally. The root of the problem lies with the policies of the CCP in Xinjiang and the CCP's abandonment of its own previous multiculturalism. The United States cannot deliver a message calling for cultural tolerance if it sounds or acts culturally intolerant itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Millwood. I now recognize Mr. Nuri Turkel for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Meeks, Ranking Member McCall, and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, commonly known as UHRP, at this critically important hearing. This is my 4th time testifying in Congress in the past 3 years on the same issue. I truly appreciate your leadership in prioritizing this issue. I want to highlight a new phase in the Chinese government's genocidal policy against the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in my ancestral homeland. UHRP has warned for more than 3 years that the end goal of this policy is the destruction of Uyghur culture, traditions, language, and faith. Simply put, Chinese state has criminalized being Uyghur. The Chinese state has spent the last 4 years crushing our culture, language, civilizational accomplishment in poetry, literature, the arts, and theology, architecture, and scholarship. The Uyghur imams, religious scholars, university presidents, professors, and teachers, successful business owners, entrepreneurs, they have all been swept en masse into the modern-day industrial-scale concentration camps. In many cases, the entire families have disappeared. Very soon, anything that can be described as Uyghur in our homeland will be an empty shell, a Potemkin show. This is already a reality given the lackluster international response to this staggering 21st century high-tech genocide. I want to emphasize that genocide denial is in full swing. Chinese government is not only implementing a brutal policy of state violence, causing immeasurable human suffering, it is also demanding that the world phrase its policy. In a way, CCP is trying to normalize its state violence against a vulnerable ethnic and religious community. The CCP now is producing a daily stream of statement, videos claiming that it deserves praise for helping Uyghur life, quote, a happy life, unquote. The government goes even further. It forces Uyghurs to participate in genocide denial. Officials are forcing them to dance and sign for the cameras to show how happy they are. The dozens of Uyghurs have been forced to make videos denouncing their relatives abroad, including our fellow Americans, for speaking up for their freedom. In February, UHRP released a report on this cruel propaganda, forcing Uyghurs to say scripted lines such as, quote, the government never oppresses us, unquote. The government is also turning out aggressive propaganda campaign against the global campaign to end state-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region. The latest effort was government manufacturers' boycott by Chinese consumers against foreign brands to defend the so-called Xinjiang cotton. One video in this campaign showed Uyghurs dressed in traditional performance costumes holding a floppy ball of cotton in each hand, dancing and singing a song phrase of Xinjiang cotton. It is just sickening. In the short time I have left, I'd like to raise several policy recommendations. I urged Congress to act quickly to pass Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which your committee marked up on April 21. Thank you so much for your leadership on that. The Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act designates Uyghurs as a P2 refugees. This urgently needed to save Uyghurs who are at risk of refoulement in multiple countries. The United States should also urge every signatory of the Genocide Convention to fulfill their obligations under Article 1, the obligation to prevent genocides, and even without making a legal atrocity crimes determination, Article 1 obliges states to take an action to prevent an unfolding genocide. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I also hope you will ensure that American Olympic athletes are not forced to compete in the shadow of the concentration camps at the 2022 Olympics in Beijing. The United States should coordinate with like-minded countries to ensure that the 2022 Games do not take place in Beijing as long as atrocity crimes continue. The United States can and should do more to prevent Silicon Valley and the US universities from cooperating with CCP or CCP-funded companies selling the so-called Muslim tracking facial recognition system being used in this high-tech genocide. I provided several other policy recommendations in my written statement that I would be happy to address them later. In closing, I'd like to thank this committee again for the opportunity to testify and for your commitment to end the ongoing genocide. I'm profoundly grateful, and thank you, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And I want to thank each and every one of you for your testimony this morning, this afternoon. I'm now going to recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to the House rules. And all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we will come back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally and identify yourself so that we know who is speaking. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Tusine, let me just say to you first, your testimony, which hit me deeply. No human being should ever have to go under the horrific treatment that you did. I thank you so much for testifying today and for your bravery and candor and sharing your story to expose the PRC's horrendous treatment of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. And this is especially true because Chinese authorities have prevented journalists and researchers and people on the ground from doing so. And so it's so significantly important that we, the members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, were able to hear from your lips your experiences. And I was really horrified when you said that even when you were allowed to leave and were in Kazakhstan, and to the degree even here in the United States, that you are afraid of the long reach of the PRC government and the extraterritorial threats and harassment that you have faced from the Chinese authorities while on foreign soil after you left China. So the first thing I'm trying to find out is, number one, has anyone from the PRC tried to contact you or harass you or do anything while you've been here in the United States? And if so, how can the United States and other governments better protect Uyghurs abroad, wherever they may be? Ms. Tusine.
Tursunay xanımға sual. Tursunay xanım guvaqlıq bəginizdən intayın təəssürləndim. Əslində heç bir insan siz uçuğan muamlığa uçunsa boladı. Guvaqlarınızdan rəhmətimni eytmən sizə. Muşiyaga kelib guvaqlığınızı berib bizə Xitayning sizga bo'lgan muomalasini fosh qilishingizga intayin rahmatimni bildirman. Men sizdan so'raydigan birinchi savolim bo'lsa, siz Amerikaga kelgandan buyon Xitoyning odamlari siz bilan aloqalashib boqqani bormi?
Men rahmat aytaman. Men bizning mushtaradimizni anglab, bizdek mushtaq bir shunchalik ig'ir zulm uchrayotgan bir millatning, bizdek bir ziyonkashlik uchrayotgan bir insonlarning dardini anglayotgan sizlarga rahmat, chin qalbimdan rahmat aytaman.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to you as well. Thank you for listening to what I had to say and to listening to what is happening to an ethnic group that is being treated so horribly.
Qozog'istonda vaqtimda har doim tahdid silib telefon qilib aloqalashib turadi, lekin Amerikaga kelgan yoqi undaq bo'lmadi. Aloqalashmadim. Men qo'rqib aloqalashmadim.
When I was in Kazakhstan, they called me regularly and threatened me, but they have not done so since I came to the United States, nor have I attempted to contact them. Андан Турсунай сизден сурайдыган икkinchi суалым болса, Amerika hükümeti kandaq kılganda Uyg'urlar ve başka Türkiye milletli chet elde turvatkan Uyg'urlar ve başka Türkiye milletten bolgan adamlarını qo'llab qutqizalaydi.
That I want to take flying lessons. Men bu siyasi cihetdeki bu sualga endi cevap bersem bo'lar.
I'm not, my apologies, I'm not quite sure how to answer such a political question.
Okay, well, thank you. And again, I just want to thank you for your testimony. I will take it with me forever, understanding the atrocities that have taken place around the world. It is harmful to the human race for this still to be taking place in 2021. And it's indeed very important for every human being, let's know members of the United States Congress. We will make sure that your story gets out, and we will not sit back and allow it to continue without the United States working with other international countries to speak out loudly and clearly, so that the genocide and the abuse to people simply because of their religion or ethnicity, that cannot take place, and we will work to make sure we stomp that out.
Sizlarga davomli tirishchanlik ko'rsatib sizlarni qo'llashga yana bir qatam rahmatimni deyman sizga guvohlik berganingizga.
So now I go to Mr. Turkle or Mr. Millwood. You know, hearing that story really has got me. I'm just really quite upset, and even though I knew it, hearing it, you know, if you're a human being, gets to your very gut, and it's gotten to me. Let me ask, in coordination with the United States, the UK, and maybe Canada, the European Union, you know, I know in March, we imposed sanction on 4 Chinese officials in Xinjiang, the Public Security Bureau, over human rights abuses. And as a response, China sanctioned 4 entities and 10 European lawmakers and diplomats and their families. What is a sustainable and effective strategy for the imposition of sanctions when faced with baseless retaliations by the PRC? And what can the U.S. government do to protect individuals and organizations that speak out against these human rights violations from Chinese retaliatory measures? Mr. Turkle or Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Chairman. That's a great question. When we talk about the targeted sanction, oftentimes you hear a pushback saying, this may not be an effective method. The China is a big country. It may not be able to create a dent and force them to change their behavior. But based on the recent Washington Post article, one of the major suppliers of yarn complained about losing about $100 million in 1 year, simply because of US companies canceling out contracts. That shows that our strategy is working. So the sanction, currently there have been 74 punitive sanctions have been announced, including 52 entity list designation, global Magnitsky sanction against XPCC, Xinjiang Production Construction Corp, which is a paramilitary, reportedly owns or manages 800,000 shell companies around the world, largely responsible for the ongoing cotton trade, the enslavement of the Uyghurs. So we're on the right track, but this has to be expanded. I agree with Dr. Millward that naming shaming in dealing with communist China, the leadership, works. They care about 2 things. One, how they're being portrayed in public. We're doing exactly that. As a result, European parliamentarians, including my 2 commissioners at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, been sanctioned, in addition to members of Congress, former Trump officials, senior officials, including Secretary Pompeo. It shows that our message is being heard in Beijing. So we need to continue to call them out publicly. And then 2, as I stated in my testimony, we need to focus on China's economic interest, the export and the technology. I participated in study researching the export volume to the United States. This has been reported by multiple organizations, but namely Center for Strategic International Studies reported that during the period of April 2019 through April 2022, Xinjiang exports to the United States increased nearly by 250%. That shows the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. So we need to expand our practice, the ongoing pressure on the businesses. And as we speak, as you well know, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
I have to cut you off because my time has expired. I want to make sure I get to many members. So I now will go to questions and ask and yield to Ranking Member McCall for any questions that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Ms. Tersenay for her powerful testimony. As you, Mr. Chairman, I was also very moved by her personal experience, but also her courage and bravery to speak out the truth, even though the threat from the CCP is very real. So, Ms. Tersenay, I just had a question for you. Can you explain to members of this committee why the CCP views the Uyghur Muslim culture and religion such a threat that it would open up concentration camps and commit these horrific acts of genocide?
To'g'risini xonimga savol. Menmo rahmatimni bildirman, menmo shu o'xshash intayin ta'sirlandim. Sizning jasurligingizdan intayin ta'sirlandim. Mening sizdan so'raydigan savolim, bu partiya nemishqa Uyg'urlarning madaniyatini, Uyg'urlarning dinini, nemishqa Uyg'urlarning madaniyati va dinidan shundoq qo'rqaydigandu? Buni bir tushuntirib bera olasizmi?
Men rahmat aytaman sizlarga yana bir qatim. Uni kelgandim, men ashundaq tushunmay qolaman. Uni u yerda ashundaq ular haqiqiy ashundaq bir bizning dinimizdan Uyg'urlar bir qo'rqinchli narsa his qildi. Hatto Xitoy hukumatining ash jazo lagerida men bo'lgan vaqtimda har biri bizning hech qanday qo'limizda hech qanday narsa yo'q. Ashning kamerning ichida necha saqchilar qurolli ko'mir uyning ichida turgan bo'lsaqmi, bizdan ular bir xil qo'rqqandek ashundaq muomala qildi. Qurolli kirib qurolli chiqib bizga hech nima yo'q qo'limiz ashtaq ma'saqmi. Bular bizni faqat dunyodan yo'q qilish degandek bir ashtaq xarakterlik qildi. Lekin men shuni tushunmayman. Nima bu bizning u yoqda qo'rqinchli hech qanday ish qilmaymiz. Ularga hech qanday bir Uyg'urlar hech qanday bir qonunsiz ish qilmaydi. Lekin bu bir dunyo ekayotgan tahdid deb o'ylayman bu. Faqat qo'rqib emas, Uyg'urlardan qo'rqib yoki Uyg'urlar bir ish qo'yamdi deb o'ylamaydi. Cho'qim bu butun dunyo qilayotgan tahdid Uyg'urlar orqali deb o'ylayman. Bizga ham shuni davomli miyamiz qo'ydi ashulagan maqsad.
I also want to say thank you to you. Similarly, I also don't exactly understand why, but they truly seem to feel that we are terrifying. In the time when I was in the concentration camp, we had nothing on our persons. The police had weapons, and still they treated us like we were terrifying. And it seems to me like they just want to get rid of us from this earth. I don't understand, but this really is a threat to the whole world, and I think that they are sending this threat to the world through what they are doing to Uyghurs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tersenay. I mean, the CCP officials has said openly, you can't uproot all the weeds hidden among the crops in the field one by one. You need to spray chemicals to kill them all. If that doesn't speak to genocide, I don't know what does. Mr. Mr. Turkle, I wanted to ask you about your family. I understand you still have family in the Xinjiang province, how their well-being is, and have they or you received threats from the CCP for your service?
Thank you very much for asking that question. I came to the United States 26 years ago. Of those 26 years, I was only able to spend 11 months with my parents. You know, my background, the way that I was brought to this world. Half of my life, my parents are missing. And simply because CCP, they don't allow my parents to come to spend the rest of their time, whatever the time they left in this world. Both of my parents are experiencing serious health issues. They have 5 American grandchildren, 2 American sons, and yet the CCP is preventing them to leave. Because of my prominence in the Uyghur human rights work, I've been dealing with on and off threats. But what is most egregious is that since I've been appointed as a commissioner to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, their pressure has been stepped up. I have been unsuccessful in my attempts to get my parents out of China, to take them to hospital to provide a proper care. That is not happening. I've been trying to reunite with my family since 2009, unsuccessfully.
And final question. I think the naming and shaming is a great idea. The targeted sanctions economic on those profiting off slave labor and concentration camps. As we look towards the Olympics, I think there will be a diplomatic boycott, but I believe the corporate sponsors will still be involved. And I think there needs to be some sort of corporate responsibility here. Can you and Mr. Millwood perhaps speak to what we could do in the Congress to instill this corporate responsibility as the Olympics, if and when they go forward?
I'll speak briefly to that, if I may. First of all, thank you, Mr. McCall, for that question. I think, in the past, a lot of people have looked at the Olympic issue and looked back at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and have said that the boycott was not useful. I think it was useful. I think we need to use the opportunity, though, to have as many conversations, to bring corporations into it, to bring the athletes themselves, to spread the message rather than being a single up and down decision made, for example, by the president.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we wouldn't, if we boycotted Munich during the Nazi regime, we wouldn't have seen Jesse Owens prove to Hitler that his Aryan race was not superior. And I don't know if boycotting the Russian, I do think the athletes deserve their time, but I think this corporate responsibility notion needs to be, any ideas you have moving forward, I would love to hear those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Brad Sherman of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and continuing the efforts of our committee to focus on the genocide of the Uyghurs. We had a hearing on this in December of 2019 when I chaired the Asia Subcommittee. I commend to those who are watching this hearing to go back and look at the transcript of that one. In that hearing, we heard from Mr. Berkat Jadat, whose mother, and he spoke so eloquently, was in detention for 15 months. The issue before us is what should we do? So far, we have passed through the House and Senate only some modest acts that are aimed at particular individuals. Often, this is a way to make us feel like we've done something by denying tourist visas and to people who don't want to visit the United States, and freezing the U.S. assets of individuals who don't have assets in the United States. We came close in 2019 to passing more significant legislation, which was the Uyghur Act. I had introduced the Uyghur Act, but this was actually Rubio's bill, which we in our committee used to put a lot of House content in it Unfortunately, having passed the Senate, having passed the House, the Senate refused to deal with it. Ultimately, though, focusing just on individual people or individual products is probably not going to get the Chinese government to change that much. It does contribute to our sense of purity. So we can say no American lips have touched a slave-picked tomato from Xinjiang, but it just not being able to sell certain tomatoes in the United States is not going to get Beijing to change its behavior. To change its behavior, what we need is across-the-board tariffs on all Chinese goods. And this will give us the bargaining power we need to deal with China on a host of issues, especially human rights. And it will also reduce Chinese power, which is very substantial here in the United States. China has that power because we're so dependent upon them in our supply chains. We've talked so much about the plight of the Uyghurs, and I think the testimony has been illuminating, but I'd like to ask Mr. Turkle about the policy of Muslim states around the world. Here you have a Muslim group being oppressed in large part because of their religion. And the government of Turkey has at least said a few things under some pressure from Turkic nationalists in Turkey, but virtually the entire rest of the Muslim world has been silent. What can we do to get the Muslim world to be hopefully even tougher on this than we are? What can we do to get the Muslim street around the world to appreciate that whether it's Kosovo, Bosnia, the Rohingya, or the Uyghurs, it is the United States that has played the greatest role in the world in trying to protect this oppressed Muslims. So what do we do to both galvanize support in Muslim countries for your cause, and what do we do to make sure that Muslims around the world know that the United States has taken the lead?
Thank you, Congressman. As you may recall, we had this conversation in our first hearing back in 2018, September 2018. It's incredible we're discussing the same issue without much progress. It's very disturbing, to say the least, that the Muslim majority countries have taken a side with CCP, even in the face of CCP calling Uyghur Islam as a mental illness. The countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, given a full support. In fact, they're publicly praising CCP for its treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs. Yeah, we can talk about economic reasons, but if more so, it appears that they found a common ground, covering each other's back. These countries are not a Jeffersonian democracy, but we can just ignore them for a while. But there are a few other countries have been, in the mildest manner speaking, the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example. Kosovo signed a joint letter after the ministerial, and also Qatar withdrew a support of that letter, 39-country letter that they submitted to the UN Human Rights Council. So there's some, it's plainly, if I can put it plainly, countries are doing a better job rallying support within these countries. So I think diplomatic effort would be very effective. So we can start this with the Organization of Islamic Conference. This administration is doing exactly the right thing, engaging with our partners and allies. And this should be taken to the UN. We have last year we didn't have.
Expired. So I got to get to the rest of the members. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and especially for holding this important hearing. Mr. Chairman, as you know, since 1983, I have raised the issue of the one-child, now two-child per couple policy, which has been used with devastating impact on women and children in all of China, with forced abortion and forced sterilization as its means of implementing the one or two child per couple policy. Now we see, and this has been around for a while, it's not new, but the whole idea of coercive population control is being used against the Uyghurs. And Mr. Turkle, you pointed out some very devastating numbers that say that 84% of the birth rate has, or the population has dropped by 84% between 2015 and 2018, and 24% in 2019. I have worked with many individuals inside of Xinjiang with regards to this issue for years. This is a form, it's one of the definitions of the Genocide Convention, Article 2. There's 5 of them. One of them is imposing measures intended to prevent birth within a group. All 5 of the criteria for the Genocide Convention are being violated by the PRC, by Xi Jinping, with impunity. And I just want to ask a couple of questions of Mr. Turkle, if you would. And first of all, thank you for making the Forced Labor Prevention Act, introduced by Mr. McGovern and I, your first priority, at least listed number 1, because I think, as my colleagues know, and you marked it up in committee the other day, Mr. Chairman, it would create a rebuttable presumption that all goods produced in the region are made with forced labor unless U.S. Customs and Border Protection certifies by clear and convincing evidence that goods were not produced with forced labor. So it shifts the whole presumption. These products will not come here unless they can prove that they were not made with forced labor. But if you could speak to this issue of this horrible issue of coercing women, of stealing their babies and destroying them by dismemberment or chemical poisoning, which is an outrage. And more needs to be done. Secondly, you say that in the United Nations, the U.S. should bring the issue to the UN Security Council, and you asked the Biden administration to do that. Have you had any feedback as to whether or not they will? They also say that the U.S. should urge the UN Human Rights Council to go beyond the fruitless demand for an international delegation to have access, to just do remote monitoring. We know what's going on. We want more information, but they're going to deny access until the cows come home. And finally, on the Genocide Olympics, I'm going to be chairing a hearing probably on the 18th on the Genocide Olympics with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. And, it seems to me that the change of venue is still a viable option if there is the political will. And again, as my friend Mr. Call, ranking member, mentioned, the fact that corporate America is going to be aiding and abetting an Olympics at a venue where there is a current day genocide occurring, plus other massive human rights violations, is absolutely unconscionable. So if you could, Mr. Turkle, speak to those issues.
Thank you very much. The forced sterilization, population control, is one of the most effective methods or practices in a genocidal campaign. The family planning policy has been enforced, as you're well aware from your hearings from the mid-90s, late 90s even, that this is an ongoing process, but it's only accelerated in the last few years based on the Chinese government's own report. So why do they do this? They wanted to prevent the Uyghurs to exist on the face of the earth. I recently had a chance to interview one of the former camp employees, teachers. She told me that she was forced to go through sterilization at the age of 50. So this is outrageous. This should be. I don't think that there's a mechanism to address this. Maybe Congress should consider looking into the way to handle this legislatively or through a legislative mandate. On the Olympic issue, I think it's not unusual for Olympic Committee to consider postponing the next year's Olympic if relocation turned out to be a difficult proposition. It is unfair to our athletes, American athletes, to compete while the genocide is ongoing and in the backdrop of the concentration camps. And also, let's be reminded of the history. In 1936, when Hitler held the Berlin Olympics, he was already built Dachau. He was engaging in forced sterilization. He was engaging in forced labor. And 3 years later, he invaded Europe. Should be concerned about China may following a similar practice. We can sense impatience in Beijing to achieve the global ambition. So this should be concerning. We can put aside all the human rights concern, but this can be geopolitical, national security concern for the United States.
Thank you.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now will recognize Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, who's the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, for 5 minutes, after which I will pass the gavel to the vice chair of the committee, Mr. Tom Malinowski. And as I have to leave, I just want again to thank the witnesses, especially Ms. Toussaint, for her very, very moving and bold testimony here today. It is something that I will long remember, even past my time here in Congress. Thank you, and Mr. Connolly, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. I think you have to unmute, Mr. Connolly. You're still on mute, Mr. Connolly. You have to unmute. Samantha, look like we're having technical problems. Let's come back to Mr. Connolly. Let's now go to Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, who's the chair of the subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and global counterterrorism. And we'll see if we can get back to Mr. Connolly.
Thank you very much, Chairman Meeks. Thanks for convening this really important hearing. Thanks to our witnesses for testifying this afternoon. For years, the government of the People's Republic of China has used false pretexts to repress and discriminate against Turkic Muslims and other minority groups, particularly the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And to harass members of these groups located in other countries. Reports describe a systematic program by the PRC government involving the arbitrary detention of more than 1 million Uyghurs, as well as torture, beatings, food deprivation, sexual assault, forced sterilization, denial of political, religious, cultural, and linguistic freedoms, so much of which we've heard about powerfully from our witnesses today. Congress is taking important action to assist Uyghurs, including passing Representative McGovern's Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which sanctions PRC officials for responsible for the repression of Uyghurs. And I'm proud to have supported this and other measures. However, more needs to be done. That's why I introduced the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act in March to provide priority to P2 refugee status to Uyghurs and other minority groups facing persecution by the PRC government. P2 is for groups of special humanitarian concern who are designated for resettlement processing and provided direct access to the U.S. refugee system. The bill also streamlines the asylum process for Uyghurs, encourages allies and partners to also accept Uyghur refugees, and encourages the Secretary of State to prioritize the plight of the Uyghurs in bilateral relations with third countries that host Uyghurs. Legislation demonstrates congressional interest in assisting the Uyghur people and signals support for the Biden administration's efforts to aid Uyghurs and others persecuted by the PRC. The bill has received bipartisan support, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Representative Smith, for introducing it with me, and thank the half dozen other members of the committee who have already agreed to co-sponsor. For centuries, the United States has had a proud history of welcoming oppressed peoples from around the world. And we are right to focus on actions within China. The Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act is a continuation of the best tradition of U.S. foreign policy and humanitarianism, and upholds America's image of a beacon of hope and refuge and liberty to millions worldwide. So I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and other members of this committee to advance this bill and provide additional support for Uyghurs. Now, Mr. Turkle, in your written testimony, you expressed support for providing P2 status to Uyghurs and expediting Uyghur asylum cases. Can you please describe the barriers that Uyghurs face, both in immigrating to and declaring asylum in the United States?
Congressman, thank you so much for introducing that bill. I thought it was necessary and a critically important bill. The humanitarian intervention is something that we could do while the diplomatic engagements and activities are ongoing. There are two major challenges for the Uyghur refugees around the world. In the homeland, there are heavy backlog being created since 2013, preventing affirmative asylum applicants to go through the adjudication process, simply showing up at the asylum office to have a hearing, asylum interview. We can work to expedite that. The Uyghurs are not asking for blanket immigration status. They just like to have a day with asylum officer to tell their story why they cannot be returned to China in the face of the ongoing genocide. On the other countries, particularly in the Middle East, Turkey to be exact, there are a large number of Uyghurs have been wandering in hiding because most of the host countries have derogatory information on them. They also collaborate with the Chinese state, namely countries like Egypt, UAE, have deported Uyghurs who are seeking or facing a danger in the country. So the ideal way of handling this issue once we have the legislation is to set up a independent mechanism, either at the state, at the embassy, or through an NGO to go through independent vetting process so that we can avoid that derogatory information provided by CCP to those host countries being used against them.
Mr. Turkle, thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, there is so much that we can do through this legislation and the ongoing focus of this committee. I'm grateful for your attention, the ranking member's attention, and leadership of both of you on this vital issue, and I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you so much, Representative Deutsch. Representative Chabot is next for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my good friend and colleague, Mr. Sherman, raised a question already that I wanted to focus on, but I'll expand it a little bit. And I'll go to Dr. Millward and then back to Mr. Turkle on it if he had anything he'd like to add. And that's the frustration that I feel, and I think many of my colleagues, with the Muslim countries across the globe who basically have stood by silently, or sometimes even worse, as Mr. Turkle mentioned. And either they're cowed by the PRC, or they're afraid of their reach or their economic power, or something keeps them quiet on one of the most horrific human rights abuses on earth today. And what, if anything, can either we or our allies or others do to modify the way they are looking at this and actually step up and help us? It seems the U.S. is out there, unfortunately, too often alone on these issues. Some of these other countries that we're supporting in many other ways and have helped them so much are just silent on something that they ought to be aggressively speaking out on. So, Dr. Millward, could you comment on that?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the U.S., although the measures that we've been taking now are a very good step, we were a little bit slow, really at least a year slow in our own responses to the atrocities in Xinjiang region. The recent work with our allies in Europe, Canada, UK, I think that's a very, very positive step because it's presenting an international view of what's going on as opposed to simply it being a bilateral US response. I think this kind of diplomatic work can be extended to beyond traditional NATO allies, to other countries. There was that list which Mr. Turkle referred to of signatories of a letter in the UN of 37 other countries. That list included many Muslim majority countries, indeed, but it also included many countries that are not Muslim either. And the issue here, I think, is much more that of authoritarian countries with their own very bad human rights records, signing on with China and forming sort of a bloc, an authoritarian bloc in the UN Human Rights Council, for example. So I think more US involvement in the UN, getting back onto the Human Rights Council there, and continued diplomatic work. There were some Muslim countries that did not sign that letter. Malaysia did not sign that letter. Bangladesh did not sign that letter. And so there are some possibilities that we can work with. Turkey, I did not, in fact, sign it, although their position on this is complicated. So there are many opportunities, I think, for gaining Muslim countries' agreement on this. The country of Qatar initially signed and then unsigned that letter with the authoritarian government. So progress can be made. It will take diplomatic work, perhaps quiet diplomatic work, maybe some guarantees that the U.S. is going to stand up for this and not waver ourselves.
Thank you. Mr. Dukel, did you want to comment any further?
Yes, we need a bigger boat, Congressman. This should not be the only matter for the United States government only to consider a concern. Our traditional allies and partners start coming along, but we can do a better job in Central Eastern European countries. Some countries that Dr. Miller was mentioning used to be fighting against the same fight that the Uyghurs been fighting, communism. So yeah, we have to engage, and we have to deepen the public engagement, public diplomacy particularly. Using the local population would be very useful. Like, for example, in Europe, if our embassy organizes the victims as camp survivors to meet with their own government and engage them, that may be helping them to get on board. Personal contact can be very powerful, as we have seen Tursnai's testimony today. So our embassies could arrange that kind of meeting with the local governments. The Uyghurs have some problem. Try not to engage with the governments in their host countries. The same thing in Australia, same thing in Germany. So if our embassy could help them to set up that kind of contact with their governments, could help us to bring them on fold, in the fold.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're going to go to Representative Bera for 5 minutes now.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. And thank you for this important hearing. I'm going to follow the line of questioning that my colleague from California, Mr. Sherman, initially started, which is how do we engage the Muslim majority countries in this fight? And, I understand that a lot of those governments are certainly authoritarian and limit the flow of information. But it's always occurred to me that if the citizens in these countries, if the young people in these countries understood what was happening, that mosques are being torn down, that people's religion are being reprogrammed, and the internment camps, that you could mobilize the masses to then get their various governments engaged. Maybe Mr. Kirkle, this is a question to you. Within many of these Muslim majority countries, how aware are the citizens, the young people in the countries, of what's going on in Xinjiang?
I think because of there's one key issue that we have to tackle, that is disinformation. Some reason the Chinese have been very effective misinforming the public in the Muslim countries. To this day, they are actively telling the world that this is a problem that the United States made in order to prevent China rise. So disinformation, we need to tackle the disinformation campaign that the Chinese have been waging. And also we have to recognize that these Muslim countries, the citizens don't have a voice in these kind of matters. They cannot go and criticize their governments. For example, this is impossible, even Egypt in Saudi Arabia, for their citizens to say, oh, you should not take a side with CCP. So I think the diplomatic engagement, public diplomacy, engaging with those countries individually or collectively could be very helpful. We can pick a few candidate countries. I think people may have a different view, but Turkey could be a good candidate country that we should engage. Malaysia, Indonesia, they have a large Muslim population. They're also facing certain type of CCP threat. So we should engage with the government a one-on-one and high level instead of making public statements. I think that could be something very useful. In the previous administration, Secretary Pompeo went to Central Asia to engage with the Central Asian Turkic states. Secretary Blinken should do the same, engaging with people who has historical traditional ties with the Uyghurs.
So one of our best strategies in the Cold War was Radio Free Europe. And the beauty of it was we didn't have to, we were just telling the truth and making sure people had access to the truth. So Yeah, I don't know if there's ways through social media, because recently I was reading an article in the New York Times about some of the Uyghur population in Japan, and when the Japanese public was starting to become aware of what was happening in China, they started to raise the issue with their government, probably in a way that the Japanese government didn't necessarily want raised, but again, I think that the population in Europe now is very aware, which puts pressure on the EU and countries like France and Germany not to move ahead so easily with some of these trade deals. And again, maybe it is forming a coalition of like-minded, like-valued countries, getting the citizens engaged, places where you can make access to information more readily available, and then putting pressure on the UN. So having that coalition. Maybe, Dr. Millward, if you want to add anything to how we might create that global coalition in my last minute.
I don't have much to add to what Mr. Turkel just said. This is, of course, a difficult, not something that can be easily done by a single passage of a bill or something, but restoring the United States' own international reputation and various on human rights issues and so on. This is an ongoing process. It involves issues at home as well as issues abroad, and looking at our own history in the Middle East. But insofar as we can take some steps and send some signals around those things, I think it can only help in our being more persuasive in our conversations with Muslim majority countries in this discussion about China's treatment of the Uyghurs and other peoples in Xinjiang.
Great. I'm out of time, so I will yield back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to go now to Representative Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is very informative. There's a lady in my district that she's always on me about why haven't I done anything about the Uyghurs and the situation with the communist Chinese, and I'm as frustrated as she is. I'm frustrated as a committee, and I worry about the things that we're doing, if we're doing anything at all. Just another report on a shelf. And I'm wondering, with the administration, they seem to want to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party in various aspects, especially the environment. And I'm wondering, do you think it's smart for us to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party in this respect, while condemning their human rights violations? And does any of our guests feel like this can be separated? Because everybody seems to want to play ball with them, and I get it, but I'm curious of what our panel thinks.
Well, I'll try to address that. Richard, I understand your frustration, and the idea of playing ball with a regime that is doing what it's doing in Xinjiang is a very difficult one. In my written testimony, I was playing around how to suggest we think about this, and I came up with the phrase of compartmentalizing when necessary, but do not minimize or marginalize human rights issues. And I'm sure I'm telling you and others in the U.S. government, something you already know by saying this. That's how politics is done, and that's how we do things. But with environmental issues, we are facing global problems, and it's also an economic problem. And there is the ironic issue that much of the polysilicate, I believe it's called, which is used to make solar panels, actually is sourced in Xinjiang. So I'm not sure if polysilicate will become the next cotton or tomato. But the point is, we are all really linked together economically, just as we are linked together morally with these problems. And we need to be talking about them and be pushing on them. And insofar as we can agree on something and have some conversations going on over the environment, and recent signals have been a little more positive that the PRC and US can work on some of that. That can only make it easier to address the more thorny issues at the same time. So although it does involve, keeping contradictory ideas in our minds simultaneously. At least from my point of view, as someone who has conversations with Chinese colleagues and friends about this all the time, it's important to have some common ground, maybe to retreat to now and then, and so then we get out onto the rhetorical battlefield at other times and really work on the more difficult issues.
I just think too much we're listening to the Chamber of Commerce, and maybe we need to listen to our hearts a little more. That almighty dollar seems to be the driving factor in all of this for us anyway. And going back on what you said, though, it's easier to prevent imports coming in from Xinjiang, but there's a report that 80,000 Uyghurs have been transferred and forced to work in factories in other Chinese provinces. And, what can we do to improve that supply chain tracing? I mean, this is a joke. We put it on one province, but we don't put it on the whole. Oh, that's not the whole country, Birch. And I get that. But there again, when are we gonna start listening to our hearts instead of the chambers of commerce?
Here I will agree with you. It's definitely not just Xinjiang, it is the whole country. And I mentioned in my written testimony, there's a program in China known as the Partnership Pairing Program, or the Counterpart Pairing Program, which actually created sister city relationships between provinces and cities of Eastern China, rich provinces and cities, to go into Xinjiang and build factories and build industrial zones and provide educational training. And there are news reports that some of this, in fact, is directly involved with the Gulag, with the system of prisons. So I think we need to expand our ambit in what we're looking at to see what is the involvement of Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and all of the others in what's going on in Xinjiang. And that will, of course, create more pain, but it will also create more pressure. And so I would very much agree with you, Representative Burchett.
Yeah, we're out of time. I just remind everybody, every time you buy something made in China, there's probably been slaves' hands on it. And I think we need to start acting appropriately and acting like a world leader, and put the greed aside for a little while. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your time and your indulgence.
Hear, hear. Representative Titus, we'll go to you for 5 minutes now.
Yes, thank you. I met recently with some members of the National People's Congress. It was arranged by the U.S. Asia Institute. And when I mentioned the Uyghurs, there was kind of two responses. One was, of course, they denied that they were committing any kind of genocide, and in fact insisted it was just the opposite, that they had rooted out terrorist plots, they had eliminated poverty, they were giving the Uyghurs a real opportunity for a better life. And then the second argument they made was that it was really none of our business. This was internal politics of China. We didn't need to get involved in it. We had our own problems with how we treated minorities in this country. So I would ask the witnesses if they would comment about this and talk about the fact that as we do draw more attention to the problem, considering sanctions or getting some of our allies in the area to condemn it, are we running the risk of driving this underground and making it more difficult to get good information about what's happening so we can't be effective in countering it?
I can start. Thank you, Congresswoman. For the first time, Washington Post in the last 20 years has no reporter in China. Even if we go soft and hard on China, on CCP, I don't think it makes any difference. They don't even want to acknowledge that they are dragging the international community to engage with this genocidal regime in the daylight. They also have no shame referencing the Holocaust when they're talking about collective punishment. They also have no shame using their money, economic influence to buy out silence or turning some weaker countries into a client state. They also have no shame stating that the United States made some mistakes in the 19th century, therefore US has no moral authority to speak. So when a government or even individual had nothing to say, they call others liars and play a whataboutism card. So that specifically addresses why the Chinese have been coming out and engaging in these. And also Genocide denial is a very active method for the perpetrators to continue the campaign. So the longer that they can confuse people, conflate the fact, and also using some useful, excuse me for using the useful idiots in our country, from the academia, from the think tank, to take criticize our government that is injected into the Chinese official propaganda, helps the regime in Beijing. Therefore, we have to be very mindful. This regime is extremely insecure, as has been displayed in Alaska. They have very specific objective, both domestically and internationally, that they wanted to create new norm. They have expanding the technology that they use to engage in genocide over 80 countries. We have much bigger problem to deal with. As I pointed out earlier, the United States remains to be the largest destination for Xinjiang exports as we speak. So it took us almost 20 years to get this problem. It takes even longer probably. Even it requires more innovative, creative, bold responses to tackle this monumental challenges that we're facing.
No, thank you. I was afraid of something like that. I would ask Ms. Toursune, if that's pronouncing it correctly. Thank you for your courage and being with us today. I would like to ask if she could comment about the Uyghur community that's outside of China, that's looking over its shoulder, worrying about being repatriated. Is there any special targeting or harassment or problems particular to women and girls that you know about who are facing those kinds of issues?
Жасырлығыңыздың рахметімні білдірмен сізге. Сіздің білішіңізше, bu Xitayning sirtidagi Uyg'urlarning arasida maxsus qiz ayollarga qaratilgan tahdid silish yoki bo'lmasa boshqa kontrol qilishdak ashunday ishlar bormi bilishingizcha?
Tushunmadim, qandaq Uyg'urlarning arasida Uyg'urlarning arasida tushunishlik bu. Gapingizni tushunmadim. Uyg'urlarning orasida masalan kim taklif soldi yani? Uyg'urlar o'zlari?
Xitoy hukumati.
Masalan, vatanning ichidagini bilamsiz, hozir men gapingizni faqat tushunaman.
I am going to re-explain the question, thank you. Yeah, Xitoy hukumati hozir shu vatan sirtidagi Uyg'ur qiz ayollarga maxsus, masalan, bir chora qo'llanib yoki boshqa bir usullarni qo'llanib maxsus qiz ayollarga qaratadigan bir tahdid silishdek shunday harakatlar bormi?
Vatan sirtida deganingizni ham tushunaman. Vatan sirtida bo'lsa mushaqlab turayotganlarni demsiz, shu vatanning
chet elda.
Yo'q, u chet eldagilarni men bilmadim. Chet eldagilarni u Xitoyning hukumatining undaq. Yo'q.
I do not know of any such things.
Endi vatanning ichida bo'lsa bak ig'ir. U hatto lagerning shu vatanimizda lagerning teshida turayotgan ayollar bo'lsin. Har vaqt ashtaq tahdidga uchrab turmiz. Masalan, men lagerning teshida 9 oy bo'ldim, shu mezgilda ashtaq. Har vaqt Xitoy hukumati odamlari, saqchilari kelib bizga har vaqt nega borsan, nega butun narsani ashundaq. Bu tahdid bekchiq. Araq ichishga majburlaydigan, har qanday xayolga kelgan majburlaydigan ish. Men ketgandimmi 2019ning oxirida tex davomlashyapti. Bu sirt bu yoq kelgandan keyin Qozog'istonda yo'q, undaq emas. Telefon orqali saqchilar tahdid, undan boshqa yo'q. Undaq men bilmadim.
So I don't know of anything outside, but back in the homeland, even outside the camps, there are such threats that are specifically targeted at girls and women. So I was living outside the camp for 9 months. And in that period, there were all sorts of threats. People from the government, police would come around, would call all the time. They forced us to drink alcohol and so forth. At the end of 2019, those things were still going on, but I didn't see any such things after I went to Kazakhstan.
Okay. Well,
other than by telephone.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you so much. We will now go to Representative Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. And as to this absurd moral equivalency argument about the United States and our history relative to what's happening in Xinjiang, I would just say for the record, and I shouldn't have to, that the United States is not, and the United States government is not operating concentration camps, not engaged in extrajudicial detention, collective punishment, guilt by association, systematic torture and rape, medications inducing infertility, impaired mental function, torture, rape, forced abortion, withholding medical care, intense political indoctrination. This is not happening in the United States. And so it's a shame we have to say that for the record, but this is just absurd propaganda from the CCP. Let me ask any of our witnesses. Well, actually, let me start with Professor Millward and Mr. Turkel. Tell me, what is it about the Uyghur population that creates such a sense of threat to the CCP? Why is the CCP so particularly threatened by the Uyghurs?
Well, the Uyghur region, or the so-called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, it lies outside of traditional China demographically and geographically, and was really taken over by the People's Republic of China in 1949. Now, of course, there's historical arguments about previous Chinese states being involved there, and it becomes a historical question. But essentially, it's a colonial issue that they have not wanted to recognize, and instead tried to argue through false historical narratives that the place has always been part of China. And now they've come to the extreme point where they're arguing that the people of the Uyghurs themselves, are historically Chinese, although they don't know it. That's essentially what this argument has been. And so they've gotten themselves into this extreme position. There's a lot of Islamophobia around this as well, and fear and lack of knowledge of who the Uyghurs are, because their customs are very different from those of Han Chinese, and this fear of difference is part of that as well. And so we see policies such as were mentioned by Ziauddin, forcing them to drink alcohol, or putting pressure on students or officials not to fast during Ramadan, concerns about pork. Precisely those aspects of Uyghur culture that are different from the Han make many people uncomfortable in China, and so they've been targeted by these policies.
Okay, let me ask any of the witnesses. Obviously, President Biden has appointed John Kerry as Special Envoy for Climate to dialogue with the Chinese regarding climate change. This action obviously shows that climate is a priority for the administration. The Special Envoy Kerry went to China to negotiate with the CCP. President Biden convened a climate summit, invited President Xi to speak at that summit. Has the Biden administration taken any similar steps to stop the CCP from continuing to commit genocide against its own people? Has President Biden convened a summit to stop the genocide? Have we sent an envoy to China specifically regarding genocide in Xinjiang? What actions has the Biden administration taken that would put this issue in any remote vicinity of the priority that the administration is placing on climate?
Let me tackle that question. The Uyghur genocide, and now reportedly connected to the green technology, green investment that the Americans are making in China, particularly solar panels. Uyghurs' homeland also reportedly the largest base for windmill turbine. So I think it's reasonable to expect that the Biden administration bring up these issues, because it's been already reported. Congress is also going after these issues. Recently, Senator Rubio wrote to the organization represents solar industry. So they have been put on notice. As far as the administration's specific actions, they announced 2 coordinated sanctions last month. We are particularly pleased with Secretary Blinken's engagement with our allies and partners. As a result, we have 3 parliaments at least now, Canadian, UK, and the Netherlands, have officially recognized. We anticipate similar action in other countries, maybe Australia and others in Europe. So and one other thing that this administration done right is to raise this. And literally every public event, I've been hearing Secretary Blinken bringing up this issue repeatedly. So this is very important, especially publicly calling them out. What other additional steps taken? I could ambitiously recommend Secretary Blinken to request to visit the Uyghur homeland. This has never happened in the history. That is possible. If the Chinese have nothing to hide, open the doors to Secretary Blinken.
A good idea. My time has expired, but I hope this administration or any administration to place emphasis on this issue independent of climate and not just where slave labor converges with solar panels. I think this is an independently important issue that should be a priority for the administration, and I am encouraged with your testimony, and I hope that continues. I yield back.
Thank you so much. Representative Connolly, are you ready to jump in?
I am. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for our panel. I'm sorry I've had to go back and forth. I have 3 Zoom hearings at the same time. And Mr. Turkle, just picking up on what I heard, I mean, I find it interesting that there'd even be an inferential criticism of the Biden administration with respect to calling out the Uyghur human rights crisis, given the fact that the previous administration, led by the president himself, almost never talked about human rights, avoided it in his conversations with people like Vladimir Putin and other venues. And in the brief few months the Biden administration has been in power, what I understood from your testimony, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, please clarify if I got it wrong, but I mean, this administration actually has brought up the Uyghur human rights crisis in every exchange, public or private, with the Chinese that we know of, including Secretary Blinken's meeting with his Chinese counterparts in Alaska. Is that correct?
Yes, that's accurate statement. The one specific actions, if you will, that the Biden administration is taking is to continuancy of the policy initiatives or the executive actions put in place in previous administration. As I noted, there are 74 punitive actions that have been taken, which is very significant. I've been doing human rights work in the last 22 years. I never thought that my government will be taking such a significant action to address these issues.
I'm sorry, let me just interrupt you. You said there were 74 specific actions taken.
Yeah, punitive actions taken by the United States. Yeah.
By the Biden, this is by the Biden administration.
No, the whole previous and current administration.
By the United States government.
Yes. And one other thing that I think that Secretary Blinken or President himself should consider doing is hold a Friend of Uyghurs summit. At least taking the issue to G7 summit next month and in UK. And this has to be tackled on a really high level. Mentioning it, publicly raising it is wonderful, but a tangible, long-lasting actions are required. We need to expand the existing policies being implemented.
Let me ask you, do you believe that the United States policy could or should be more specific on items with respect to the suppression of the Uyghurs, like closing detention camps, ending family separation, and birth suppression policies, among others? I mean,
yeah.
Is there benefit in our being more specific in calling out Chinese reprehensible actions?
Absolutely. Your constituents, for example, in Northern Virginia, have been separated from their family members. Several Uyghur Americans who are either working for the U.S. government as contractors, looking for family members. The Biden administration at least tried to specifically help the Uyghur Americans to reunite with their grandmothers, grandparents, or siblings. That should be something that put on the top of the agenda. I could even go even further. The Biden administration should not should not have a meaningful dialogue on anything until at least the Uyghur American families being released from the concentration camps.
We heard from Mr. Millward that, and by the way, Mr. Millward, I agree with you, and I think it reflects on the Chinese actions in Tibet as well. There's a certain Han xenophobia within China about other ethnic groups and the need to dominate. And unfortunately, they're willing to resort to very violent and repressive practices to do that. Did you want to elaborate a little bit, Mr. Turkle, and Mr. Millwood's observation? I'm including Tibet. Mr. Millwood did not, but I think he probably would agree. I see him shaking his head. Yes, about this impulse within the Chinese culture, with the Communist Party promoting it, to dominate and repress other ethnic groups in the country.
Could
Mr. Turkle.
I'm sorry.
Yes, Mr. Millward, if you wanted to comment, of course.
Very quickly, it's not within Chinese culture, and it's within the current policies of the PRC, and I think that's important because.
I'm sorry, I want to be real clear. I didn't mean to say Chinese culture as such. I meant the communist culture of China, current China.
Current political culture, yes.
The Congressman, no country in the world treats the Muslims the way that the China does. This question came up a few times earlier. To the Chinese government, the others, particularly the people who follow Western religion, could potentially pose a political threat. So that threatens their sense of insecurity. This is why they've been primarily targeting Muslim and Christian population in the current crisis or state violence against the vulnerable minorities.
Time has expired, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to go to Congressman Stoibe next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a member of the Africa, my questions are for Mr. Turkle. As a member of the Africa Global Health and Global Human Rights Committee, I would like to touch on China's role in Africa and how this relationship can lead to detrimental outcomes to human rights. Chinese companies have been constructed or renovated, or both, at least 186 sensitive African government buildings. Burundi inaugurated a 22 million presidential palace. Zimbabwe has a 100 million parliament building. The Liberian government is expanding its Capitol building. The 66 million combined cost of the project equals more than 2% of Liberia's estimated 2019 GDP. All the buildings and many more across the continent were gifts from the Chinese government. One of the most appealing gifts Beijing offers African officials is help maintaining power. Chinese infrastructure projects often happen around their election season. Chinese companies are well suited to provide a political boost, but because they can move quickly, in part because many are willing to forego environmental impact studies or ignore local labor laws. Many African rulers will likely side with Beijing over Washington on key issues and in international settings like the United Nations. African states comprise nearly half of the 37 signatories of a 2019 open letter defending China's human rights abuses of its minority Uyghur population. I introduced a resolution condemning the United Nations decision to appoint China a seat on its Human Rights Council on April 1st, 2020, and demand serious human rights reform. Even though the U.S. is by far the largest humanitarian aid donor to Africa, it'll be difficult for Washington to build global momentum for holding Beijing accountable, given how unlikely many African leaders will risk angering China. The large, dependable block of African support that China enjoys will remain a competitive advantage for the Chinese Communist Party. African governments are helping downplay Beijing's large-scale human rights abuses in the Uyghur region and have helped Chinese nationals win leadership of influential international organizations. Can you please share any thoughts or potential solutions on this very important issue?
That's an excellent question. The ongoing the crisis is a international aspect to it, particularly on China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. In late 2018, a state-run media mocked the United States by stating something along the lines of, while the United States destroy your cities, kill your people, we help you to rebuild your schools, roads, your infrastructure. The way that we're dealing with world's so-called Muslim problem, you should follow our model. So that is one of the official campaigns, in addition to the economic activities taking place all around the world. There's the same thing as in Central Asia, similar situation in Southeast Asia. I don't particularly follow in Africa, but I wouldn't be surprised that the Africans also feeling stuck in this ongoing geostrategic activities engaged by CCP in Africa.
I introduced a bill that would keep Huawei Technologies or its subsidiaries and affiliates on the entity list. What other measures do you recommend Congress take up to prevent Chinese companies gaining wealth in the United States and to ensure U.S. companies do not have ties to Uyghur forced labor?
Secretary Blinken told Congress in his confirmation hearing that he will focus on two things. One, stop forced labor coming to the United States and our technology going to China to facilitate the ongoing genocide. I don't think that the Silicon Valley has waken up to this brutality, even in the face of the ongoing genocide. Based on the various reports, the Silicon Valley companies are still providing technology, transferring technology. They haven't come out publicly condemn anything or cut ties with anything, except for Apple recently told media that they are cutting loose a questionable supplier that makes all film for the iPhones. But Silicon Valley needs to step up to the plate. They haven't really publicly, at least, recognized the seriousness of the issues. Previously, when they come to testify in Congress, most of the CEOs from the Silicon Valley companies, high-tech companies, dodged the question about at least forced labor aspect of their business practices in China.
Thank you for your time today. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record a report from RWR Advisory Group regarding companies' complicity to the Uyghurs' atrocities.
Without objection. And the gentleman's time has expired. We will now go to Representative Wild for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is to Dr. Millward. The European Parliament has spoken out and has imposed sanctions on China based on this issue. In response, China has leveled its own retaliatory sanctions, and a planned China-EU trade agreement has been put on hold. Can you describe what the impact has been of the EU moves on this issue, and whether the pressure is affecting Beijing at this stage?
I think the excessive PRC response to the EU and UK and Canadian sanctions is a good sign that that the measures that democracies are beginning to take are beginning to work. I believe that were 4 individuals in one entity, if I remember correctly, that the EU had in its own sanctions. And in response, there were many more, I think 10 or 12, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but including parliamentarians of multiple parties in Europe, including a think tank, including an academic. And it really redounded against the interests of the PRC because it ground that investment deal to a halt. And it's now, we just saw yesterday, they're no longer seeking ratification in the European Parliament for that. So I think this shows actually a kind of desperation on the part of the PRC in how to deal with these measures. And it simply shows how important multilateral responses are.
And what do you think the U.S. administration's best steps are to coordinate with the EU and other international actors on this issue?
I would say more of the same, and as has come up earlier on, a bigger boat, as Mr. Turkel said, expanding to other countries through various means that he mentioned before, just to show how seriously we take this. And it's not simply a U.S.-China issue, it's the people of the world who are responding against these atrocities.
And you're absolutely right about that. I very, very early on in my time in Congress, I was visited by a Uyghur constituent in my district whose family has been persecuted because of their ethnicity and faith. I ran into the husband of that family just the other night, and it's been now more than 2 years since I met with them, and they haven't heard a word and have no idea what has become of his wife's parents. I'd like to direct my next question to Mr. Turkle. Mr. Turkle, I'll start with the question, which is, if passed by the Senate and signed into law, what impact do you believe that the legislation that was passed by this Congress or by Congress last term, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, if we were able to get that passed by the Senate and signed into law, what impact do you believe it would have in terms of putting significant economic pressure on the Chinese government?
Thank you very much for mentioning your constituents. We're only just quickly, there are hundreds of American citizens who are not even comfortable to come out and testify on behalf of their missing family members. We've been dealing with individually, privately with the victims, but more should come out. I think this should be prioritized. Saving American families should be prioritized in anything that we do with the Chinese.
And before you answer my question, let me just add to what you just said. I mentioned that it's been more than 2 years since I met with this family. I saw the husband the other night. I learned that his wife, whose parents are the ones who are affected, is in a severe depression. She was not when I met with her. She was worried, but not in a severe depression, doesn't leave her home, and is barely able to take care of her children, 3 of whom were born in the United States. So the problem is really significant. Yeah. But now I've not left you very much time, but what do you think the economic impact would be if we were able to get this legislation signed into law?
It will be tremendous, but the action, the legislative mandate should expand entire China, not only specifically the Uyghur region. Even if we stop the forced labor practices in the Uyghur region, the Chinese could easily relocate. Actually, it's already happening. They're removing the Uyghurs to coastal area assembly lines. This has been ongoing practice, at least, in the last 20 years. We just came too late into the game to find out about these practices.
The good news about this, I think, is that we do have bipartisan support. And with that, I'll yield back. I know my time is up. Thank you very much, Mr. Turkle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now go to Representative Pfluger, please. Go ahead, sir. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this issue. And first off, I'd like to thank all of the panelists. Ms. Ziwei Wadoon, thank you for your courage. Thank you for standing up for so many others around the world, and I know that this is limited in scope to this discussion, and we appreciate your courage to stand up, to tell the truth, and to do the right thing here. It's I read your written testimony, and it's not without a lot of emotion, and so I'd like to start my questions by just asking you personally. What your thoughts are on how the U.S. Congress can help to make sure that we get the facts out and we hold those accountable for these atrocities.
Tursunay Hanım'a sual. Ben guvahlarınızı okup çıktım, nait təsirləndim. Siz şəxsən Siz Amerika Avam Partisi, Amerika'nın Kongresi hükümeti qanda qılıb şu Uyg'urlarni qo'llab, şu Xitoy hukumatini javobgarlikka tortadiganligini deb bera olamsiz? Qandaq yordam qila olamiz?
Rahmat. Men şu lagerga kirib chiqqandan keyin o'zimning psixologiyada tarafdan durs bo'lmay qilib ba'zi savollarga ashtaq jiddiyleşip cevap beremey textçilik o'zimdek qo'rqinish o'g'ashqa ashtaq ketmay Nurgun näslen değme şu hükümde turdu diyemey. İşte kıyılıp gitme. Hazır vatanimizning bizning hozir u yoqdagi ahvoli bek ig'ir. U yoq hozir Xitoy hukumatining qo'lida vatanimiz Sharq Turkistonda turayotgan Uyg'urlarning. Shuning uchun Amerika hukumatining ben bir lager şahidi bütün ahvalni ko'zimda ko'rgan sutda mening kibim anglagandan keyin mening bütün degan şahitlerimni anglagandan keyin bizning ovozimizni butun dunyoga yetkazib, butun dunyo birlikda Amerika hukumati bo'lib, hammasi cho'qim Xitoyning bu irqiy qirg'inchiligini to'xtatishga, shu zulmdan xalqimizni qutqizishga, ashaqdagi inson turg'ida o'zining vijdoni bilan o'ylab, faqat Uyg'ur demasin, bir inson turg'ida yordam berishini haqiqiy bir ish qilishni umid qilaman. Boy bir xonimning gapiga men to'liq javob berolmabdiman. Men hozir ashtaq bo'lib qoldim. Kechiringlar, yana bir qitim so'ray. O tahdid hozir bizga mushtarqim har xil suratlarimizni ko'tarib, ya'ni o'qitmay tahdid qilib bizni meshadim diyoram qilyapti. Shu aşkım mendagi qo'rqinchi texi yo'q bo'lmag'ashqim men jiq narsalarga o'shtaq to'liq javob berolmay qolaman. Kechiringlar. Har vaqt Xitoyning tashqi ishlar ministri bizning suratlarimizni ko'tarib, guvochilar ayollarning hatto shu Gulchehra xonimning nimasiga shunday yaqinda tahdid soldi. Bütün lager shahidlarining suratlarini ko'rib, har xil gaplar bilan haqoratlab bizni olmag'ir og'ziga kelgan gaplar bilan mushtaqa tahdid ham sevyapti. Ashuna hammasi. Lekin men har vaqt sizlardan o'tinib so'raydiganim, bizning ashad bo'layotgan zulmni to'xtatish uchun insoniy turg'ida yordam berishinglarni, haqiqiy bir ish qilishinglarni umid qilaman.
Thank you. So ever since I got out of the camp, I've just been so nervous and so scared. I find it difficult to speak sometimes. There are so many things that I want to say in my heart, but I can't always say them because it's very tough for me. Right now, the situation back there is very grave, and Uyghurs in East Turkestan are in the hands of the Chinese government. As a camp survivor who saw everything that's happening, what I hope is that you can make our voices heard to the entire world, that the US government can stop the genocide, that it can stop the violence against Uyghurs, and help us as humans. I hope that's what you can do, is help us as human beings. Another thing, just earlier, I didn't give a complete answer to the Congresswoman who asked a question of me. As for threats against Uyghur women abroad, they have been showing our photos and threatening us. So for example, in the foreign ministry, they've been showing our photos. They did this to Ms. Gulchehra recently. They're doing it to all of the survivors. They're slandering us, saying absolutely horrible things, threatening us with unimaginable words. And so what I always ask of you is to help us as human beings, help us end this violence.
Thank you very much. I hear the pain, and while I have no idea how what the experiences actually are, I appreciate your bravery, your courage to tell the truth here, and I hope that this committee will take that human side of it into account. And I truly appreciate your story. As a father of 3 daughters, I want you to know that I hear you loud and clear, and I think everyone on this committee does. Dr. Millward, as I listen to that and I read and hear your statement about the gratuitous provocations, what I'd like to ask you is, where do we draw the line? Because accountability does need to happen. And we need to make sure that we do hear the concerns, that we stand up for the human side of this, and that we also hold those accountable. And I'd like to, where do we draw that line, on our ability to hold them accountable? If you can explain on that. We only have 30 seconds left, please.
Well, that's, of course, the question. I think Mr. Turkel has listed ways to expand the kinds of sanctions that we can put. I've suggested that we need to look at the partnership pairing program, which brings it beyond Xinjiang to include the involvement of other corporations and other administrations throughout China. And I strongly favor those kinds of targeted sanctions, but targeting more places that are involved in what's going on. And I think that's the only thing that we really can do to maintain our own values and try and help Tursanai and her relatives and many, many others.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will now go to Representative Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall for calling this hearing. And, I think as we've listened to this testimony, we recognize that we're confronted with this incredible responsibility of shedding light on the gravest of all crimes. And as members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, as members of Congress, and frankly, as citizens of the world, we will never have a greater responsibility than to do all that we can to expose crimes against humanity and genocide and do everything we can to stop them. So this is a sober and serious responsibility, and I really thank the witnesses for their testimony. I want to start with you, Professor Millward. The Chinese government and the authorities in Xinjiang have targeted the Uyghur population using really cutting-edge technologies, obviously to censor speech with the intent of suppressing free thought and political dissent. You likened this to locking up Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other non-Han people in an extra legal network of what you described as concentrated educational transformation centers. What can the United States and our partners and the technology firms in the United States and around the world do to hinder the use of the technologies in China? And how can we better ensure that China will not, or that will at least make it difficult for China to export these technologies abroad to other authoritarian or hybrid regimes to do the same kind of harm?
Thank you for that question. I'm actually going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to toss that to Nuri, because he's gone through the specifics and knows, for example, pending and possible legislation about that.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. A couple of things we could do in the short term and the long term. One, we should start documenting the ongoing state violence against the Uyghurs with the ultimate goal to hold those to account through domestic courts or international court of justice, somewhere, somehow. That process needs to be started. In fact, the UHRP Act that Congress passed and enacted last June directs our law enforcement to specifically work on these issues. In bare minimum, protect the well-being of Uyghur American citizens here in the homeland. And also the other thing that I think will also the DOJ particularly could consider doing it is to open an investigation against technology firms that has business presence in the United States that have been responsible for facilitating the ongoing high-tech genocide against the Uyghurs. That is doable. The companies that have a business presence, active business activities, falls under the jurisdiction of our courts. That should be looked at. And then also, as a capitalist economy, we cannot dictate the companies to engage in business a certain way. But what we can do is to advise them to put in place good compliance program, good corporate governance. The previous administration issued business advisory. I encourage and urge the current administration, the Biden administration, to renew, update that business advisory so that American businesses will at least stop being complicit on ongoing crime. We've been told as consumers that the American businesses figure out to do business in China, but they're caught in crossfire. They need to be told that there's some of this behaviors need to stop.
Thank you. Ms. Tristanay, thank you for your incredibly powerful testimony. You are a woman of extraordinary courage, and I first want to say I'm very sorry that you experienced the experiences you did, and listening to your story, can't even imagine how you have suffered. But your testimony is perhaps the most powerful testimony I've ever heard, and I think that the committee and the country can hear. And so my question is, where have you found that courage to share the story, and how can we encourage other survivors to share their stories? Because I do think it is the most powerful way to activate the world against the Chinese government for engaging this behavior. And so what can we do to encourage others to do what you have done and share their experience as other survivors?
Tursunay xanımga sual. Siz intayın jasur bir ayol. Men ikağınızны anlap, şunda könglim yerim boldy. Hesdaşlyk kılaman sizge. Sizning işingizden ötküzgen işlaryňyzdan. Siz bergen guvahlyk men anlagan guvahlyklaryň en küçlüki. Sizden soraýdygan sualım, siz bundaq bir jasaratlik bir karakterni siz näden tapysız, näden tapdyňyz? Bu birinci sualım. Andan ikinci sualım, biz qanday qılıp başqalarını sizge oxşas sözletişke ilham bereleymiz? Bunu bir dep bersiňiz.
Bu cesaret kilişmağım asan bolmadı. Belki uzanlam bilsizler, men hatta Amerikaga kelmegi bu da kararga kelişke pek ters boldy imam. Lekin meniň aşı Xitay hökümetine jaza lagerindeki bile yatkan inimli kızlarning ahwallaryny öz közüm bilen görüp çykkan şahitde her wagt maňa o aram bermedi. Jürükimni tatlap kan iqtiratdy jürügimden her wagt ulan oýlaga baktymda, ulanyň meniň köz aldymda aşyn başyn maňa okşaş aşynda ahwal uçturganlaryny men öz gözüm bilen saraň bolup kalgan, hatta ilişip kalgan eşitimi bilme ölüp ketkenlerini közüm bilen kögeşke men moş kararga kelişke ahyry eşinimi karmasdan özemden öz abroýumy oýulmasdan, hatta özümniň turmuşyny oýulmasdan moş kararga kelişke. Çünkü şunun güçlük bu dünyada hakikat bar bolsa aşlarning aşlakta kıyılıp atkan Xitay hökümetiniň kulda tehmitçi şu jaza lagerlerinde 20 yıl hatta müddetsiz keçip etken beýguna kızlarning tek aç depsançylyk yaşap atkanyny men bilip turupdyman. Xitay hökümeti yalan gap kıladydy. Her wagt ýa-da hiç kандай toktap kalgany ýok. Hemmenesle neticelik kesilip ketken türmeleriniň içinde harlanyp şunuň üçin hakyky bir iş bolar dep boluş üçin eşnimi karmasdan bu jasaratga keldim. Hakyky jürek insan çagyrydygan insany toýgup adam bundaq jasarat keldi dep oýlaýman. Çünki mene o jürükimdeki o dert aşynda kılgandylam kiçkene bolsun maňa etrapymda ýardam berdigan bir insanlar jakaýsa şu jady bir ýeňgileýme dep oýdum. Maňa pek eger geldi. Şoňa hazır zemmelik. Meýli bunda kynalsam çok aşlany kutguzyş üçin ýardam berişiňden ümit kılman.
Thank you. It's not that I'm courageous, really. It was so difficult for me to get all the way here. But I think about the situation that the women I saw and know are in, and ever since then, I have no rest. I cannot rest. My heart is constantly bleeding, and I can see them in front of my eyes. These are people who experienced, the same things as I did, and I saw people who went crazy. I saw people who even died. And so I made this decision to do what I'm doing, thinking of really very little else, not even my own life. But if there is such a thing as truth, in this world, there are innocent people who are being sentenced in these camps to 20 years or to life. And China all along is lying, telling lies. I will not stop. I have found some courage from this. I think that this kind of courage perhaps comes from, a feeling of humanity. And I hope that through doing this, I will become lighter one day, because this has been so very heavy for me. And so I ask for your help in this work.
Қытайның жаза лагерінен шыққан уақытымда менің жолдасым қазақ райдан болғашқы мені шығып кетті. Мен шығып кеткен уақытымда қызларына жығылған аш яны бір қайтып есіме келді. Қатты жығылып кеткен бір қыз бойынымға естіп Алия деген. Сен жолдасың қазақ болғашқы шығып кете алдың, біз бұшың ішінде өліп кеттіміз ғой, Тұрсынай біз өліп кеттіміз ғой деп. Аштақ тақырып жығылып қалған қызлар. Aslan ahvalını bana hazırlık bilmeyme. Allah emez kalırım bilmeyme. Allah konuşamayım.
So when I got out of the camp, it's because my husband is a Kazakhstan citizen. And so I was able to get out. But now thinking of all of this, I'm remembering the sound of their crying voices. They said, you're getting out of here because your husband is Kazakh, but we are going to die here. Tursunay, we will die here. And I think of those girls. I'm not in touch with them. I don't know what's happened to them.
Well, tell her she's helping them by her voice, and I know my time has expired.
Siz avazınızı anlatıp Allah'a yardım kılıyorsunuz.
Thank you. I would just add that, and I know this is very, very difficult, but the Chinese government is very powerful. But the truth that you are speaking is much more powerful, even though you are just one person. And I hope that is some comfort.
Bundaq işning sizge nihayti tez kildiganligingizni bilaman. Xitoy hukumati o'zi bek kuchli, lekin siz Tursunay xonim, siz deyotgan gaplar texmi kuchli. Rahmat.
I will now yield 5 minutes to Representative Young Kim.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to offer my special thanks to our witnesses joining us today, and a special thanks to Ms. Ziwawudin for your bravery and sharing your story. It's heartbreaking to hear what you had to experience. And yes, you asked us to hear your testimony. We have heard your testimony, and we will take action. And we will do more to provide voice to voiceless. And this hearing is just the start of that process to amplify stories like yours. The ongoing genocide occurring in Xinjiang is as shocking as it is deplorable, and it's wrong. And I'm glad that the Biden administration has also recognized it as a genocide too. The situation in Xinjiang is unacceptable, and I call upon the Biden administration to work more closely with our allies and partners to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for its abuses and stop the wiping out of the Uyghur and Kazakh people. So let me ask Dr. Will Millward, I'm going to direct my first question to you regarding the United States support for Uyghur population in China. Can you describe some of the difficulties our Mission China personnel have faced in tackling the challenges relating to the Uyghur population in China? For example, what is the Uyghur language capability among our foreign service officers to impact our ability to operate effectively in country?
I don't know if any of our foreign service officers, I suspect a few do. I've actually known some who've asked me about how to study and so on. And so I don't want to I don't want to speak without really knowing. Clearly, we don't have a lot of that kind of knowledge. Our translator today, Dr. Anderson, is probably among the best speakers of Uyghur among non-Uyghurs in the United States, but there aren't very many such people. And I think this speaks to a slightly broader issue of Uyghur, Tibetan, perhaps even Mongolian, and you know, China is a very diverse place, and so our training about that and our foreign missions need to recognize that. I'm not saying they don't recognize that, but greater recognition of that is very important. The closure of the consulate in Chengdu, which the PRC enforced in retaliation for our closure of the Texas consulate, their Texas consulate. I think that has been unfortunate. An unfortunate side effect of that has been that the entire inland and much of the non-Han parts of the People's Republic of China are now thousands of miles further away from a U.S. consulate, which is, of course, necessary if you wish to seek visas and other sorts of things. So,
thank you, Mr. Roller.
Yes.
I do recognize there is that difficulty there, but you know, let me continue on with my questions to Mr. Turkel. Now that more countries outside of the United States and UK, including much of Europe and Australia, are finally recognizing the ongoing atrocities occurring in Xinjiang, do you view Islamic majority nations in the Middle East and South Asia as being more willing to speak out on abuses directed towards Muslim minorities living in China? What can the United States do to elevate Muslim voices around the world on this issue?
As I pointed out earlier, we need to engage, we need to step up public diplomacy, counter Chinese disinformation campaign. They have been very effective, sadly, misinforming the public in the Muslim streets. And also they've been using their economic power to buy out silence. So we need to counter these two aspects of the Chinese engagement. And also, I think this is also applies to everyone, including policymakers in the United States. No country will have an effective foreign policy engagement or policies with respect to China unless they recognize the danger that CCP is posing. So sometimes recognizing the issue, calling it what it is as important as a substantive policy response is. So I urge everyone who are in the policy position to recognize the danger that CCP is posing in international forum, domestically, diplomatically, economically.
Right. I don't think we dispute that part there. Thank you so much. Mr. Wooler, let me get back to you. As you
Time's expired, Representative Kim, actually. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so much. We will now go to Representative Phillips for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to all of our witnesses, particularly to you, Ms. Toursene. Your courage is not just an inspiration to those of us in the United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans, but all Americans and all of humanity, and we wish to thank you. I'd like to discuss and learn more about the surveillance that has been detailed to some degree, but if perhaps you could describe what you were subjected to, both when you were in detention and also when you were not. We would like to hear more. Thank you.
Турсынай ханымға суал. Лагерның içinde ve лагерның sırtında özünüz mesela qandaq küzüş ve kontrol qılınış ahvallarına yoluqdınız. Bunu bir düşündürüp bergen bolsanız.
Bu ceza lagerinin içinde Xitayning bekli kontrollukta, onun içinde fakat bir-birimizga qarab gap qilishning o'zimi bek ig'ir darajada onun içinde jinoyat hisoblanadi, gap qilmaysizlar, o'sha jazolanamiz. Shunchalik darajada boshqalarni hisob olmaganda Fakat o bir nekdir turuş, yetiş, uxlaş, hatta kayak qarab uxlaş bizning qo'llarimiz beshamon ayoq qarab uxlaysiz, oyoqqa o'rilmaymiz, madirmay uxlaysiz. Vaqt tur degan vaqtida turib bo'lsiz, tomoq ye degan vaqt kelsiz, har vaqt shunday kontrol kamera bo'ldi bir uyning ichida 2-3 yerda. Lagerning teshig'i chiqqandan keyin o'xshashlar. Şu çıkan günden başlap men lagerden çıkan günler şu günlük kelip iki adamı konuşup orlaştırıyordu. Her vaqt men yalnız uçakda yoluşum yok. Yalnız tuğan bolsam mı yenimde bir ayal kelip konatdı. Her vaqt men kontrol turatdım. Mesela bir yer beriş üçün kelip saqçıdan güvenci, üzerinden mas'ul saqçı, hatta şuçu 3 yerden tamoğa bastırıp qog'oz elib men sirtqa chiqalaytib bo'lmasa faqat u attashishning teshig'i chiqarmaydim. Har kuni berib shu qo'ng'achonlar usul o'ynash degandek shunaqa harakatlar bilan ashlarning nimasi bo'la kontrolda bo'ladi. Masalan men chiqib 7-oy bo'lgan 2019 7-oy mezgilda vizalashtirish uchun Urumchiga borgan vaqtimda ashlar faqat boshqa sirtqa chiqdim. Shundaq meni ashlar 3 poch qog'oz berdi. Shu tamoğa basgan aşnam bilan bardim. Bağan yerimde yana mana bir yer keldimde video qilib hammani atrofimni ashtaq evetme, yani saqchaga. Ashtaq kontrol qilib bo'ldim men. Budun kelganda yana saqchilar meni ash ko'chadilar, meni ko'zim kameradan chiqib turdi-ga, ko'zimdan ashni yugurib kelib meni tutib ashtaq ketadi. Nima bo'ldi deb men hayron qilib qilsam, sen nima o'g'inish kirgan ekansa, ha mundaq deb mümkün şampanjılarımı koyup tekşirip koyup etti. Fakat sırık çıkış mümkündür her vakit saqçı men bilen birga yuradi.
So in the camps, everything was controlled. To a degree such that it was difficult for us to even talk to one another. There was the threat of punishment if we did. We had to move certain ways, put our heads this way or that way. We were not allowed to move when we slept. We had to get up when they said. We had to eat when they said, and they could see everything from cameras. There were 2 or 3 of them in each cell. Outside the camps, it was very similar. For example, the very day I got out, I was assigned a man and woman to come sleep at my home at all times with me and be at home with me. So I was always under control. Just to go somewhere, I had to go to 3 different places: the Public Security Bureau, the Neighborhood Committee, and also to a special police officer assigned just to me in order to get permission to move from one place to another. In addition, every day I had to go out into the square and dance. So they even had control over what sorts of activities we did. And so after I was out in July of 2019, I went to Urumqi to get a visa. And after I was there, I didn't really even go anywhere in the city, but I had these 3 different documents that I had gotten stamped to allow me to go there. And then once I was actually there, I had to send videos back to my police officer showing where I was. When I walked out on the streets, there were cameras that, would recognize me just by my eyes. And so the cameras would recognize me, and then police officers would come out, running up to me and saying, "Oh, you're somebody who's been in a camp before." And, would ask to see my ID card and so forth.
Thank you for sharing some more detail. Mr. Turkel, you mentioned in your testimony some of the digital surveillance that is happening. Could you elaborate a bit on that practice and most importantly, how the U.S. government and the international community should be working to counter it?
In a New York Times piece in summer 2019, a reporter mentioned something quite chilling. He was standing in an intersection. He counted 20 surveillance camera over his head. That is just one street corner. So what the Chinese have done is to test and use these technology and expanding it. So the Chinese surveillance technology is metastasizing. Reportedly, over 80 countries have either adopted or in the process of adopting Chinese surveillance. What does that mean? That is a threat against civil liberty, threat against democracy, threat against international rules-based system. So this is significantly a dangerous a trend that everyone should be literally screaming from the rooftop. The Chinese use the Uyghur body, soul, their cities, homes, for testing these technology. Now it's metastasizing.
Thank you, sir. And Dr. Millward, I just have about 30 seconds left. Anything that you might want to add relative to the use of surveillance and tactics that we should be employing to counter it?
There's more and more evidence that these systems were developed in Xinjiang and aimed at non-Han peoples in Xinjiang, but they're not limited to that. As Mr. Turkel was just saying, in many ways they're expanding to other parts of China as well, and obviously around the world. But it's not simply a security measure in Xinjiang. It's much broader than that, and therefore much more worrisome.
I see my time has expired. Thank you all again to our witnesses. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Congressman Phillips. We'll now go to Congressman Levin in his car. Go ahead, Andy, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Let's pick up where Representative Phillips just left off. Dr. Millward, I point out, as I'm sure you'd agree, that a lot of these surveillance technologies and tactics, the Chinese the government started using them in Tibet, and they've greatly expanded them, and they're really using them not only in Xinjiang, but all around the country. But let me just ask you about access to information. The Chinese government is deliberately preventing journalists, diplomats, and human rights monitors from accessing the region. And then they're pushing propaganda, and we can't verify numbers or anything else independently. So can you speak to that challenge, and how should the U.S. government and the international community best counter this difficult situation?
Well, obviously, we have big problems of information. That said, our evidence about what's going on is voluminous, right? And so there are many, many ways in which, even through open source materials, research journalists can know generally what's going on. I would just say that it doesn't really serve the People's Republic of China's own purposes to keep journalists out, right? They're very, very worried about reporting on what they see as the bad stories, but there's no reporting on the good stories either that's possible. And so this leads to more distance between our peoples. It's hard to know what average people's lives are like. And so I guess we need to try to back off and restore those kinds of contacts and get journalists back in. I think access to the press should be a priority that we're pushing for in our conversations with China. And the Olympics might be one lever for that.
Broadly, there's been reporting that the Biden administration is kind of leading the G7 from a group of just industrial powers to a group of democracies, a group of countries interested in human rights. Don't you think that any solution here has to be deeply multilateral? And what is your suggestion to us, thinking broadly about, really, this gets to the whole U.S. approach to foreign policy, to tackle a problem like this, to take it on in a fully multilateral way? What does that even mean? What should we be looking for? The Olympics obviously being an example of, a whole global event, but what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, Representative Levin, was that addressed at me or
Yes, sorry.
Well, I think it. I mean, I referenced in my written remarks trying to use terms such as human values and the broader world community looking at this, trying to kind of raise our concerns to a higher supranational level. I think is very important, and address these. There's a reason why they're called human rights, right? So I think that kind of messaging would be very, very important, as well as the sorts of diplomatic work that I mentioned earlier with other nations as well, not simply Western democracies.
All right, Mr. Chairman, let me close with some words to Ms. Torsenai. Ms. Torsenai, I want you to know that I see you, I hear you, your voice is incredibly powerful, your story is so compelling, I believe you. And we, as Democrats and Republicans, as members of the House, as Americans, will share your story with all of our constituents, and we will fight for you and your people. We are your partners, and your courage is an inspiration to us. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. And why don't we translate your words?
Yes. Thank you. Tursunay Hanım'a deydiğan bir gepim. Men sizni körmen. Men avazınızı anladım. Bunu bilip koyun. Sizin hikayeniz intayin küçlük ve intayin adamını tesirlendirdiğin bir hikaye. Men sizge işinimen. Biz hemmimiz meyli oңçular bolaylı, meyli solçular bolaylı, meyli kongresinin adamları bolaylı. Biz hemmimiz Amerikalık buluş süptimiz bilen sizni kollaymiz.
Pek çok rahmet. Hammalarning mushundaq bu ko'ngil bo'lib bizning mushu bo'layotgan irqiy qirg'inchilik hozir Xitoy hukumatining mang'izayotgan Uyg'urlarga mushu irqiy qirg'inchilikni to'xtatish uchun mushtaq ko'ngil bo'layotgan har qanday hukumat o'rin bo'lsin, insoniy turg'ida yordam berayotgan har qanday insonlarga hammasiga rahmat aytaman. Chin qalbimdan peshinga rahmat aytaman. Eliman yana butun dunyoga Muş avazımızı yetkizip, yana bizning muş avazımız bulup, bütün dünyani başlap, muş Amerika hükümetinin benim kalbimde şundaq birinci orunda dep oylayman. Burun anlagandım, bütün halk başlap, insanlar oturup anlaytık, biz vatanımızda tuğandım, Amerika dese bir devlet, en bir düşüncelik bir, güçlük bir devlet dep, hatta Xitay'ımı Amerika'dan teptadı, her vakit deydiğin Amerika'dan kokumuz bulmaydigan bolsa bütün dünyanı yap koyğumuz var dep insin aragernaçı bizgime deydigan. Şu aşkı men bütün dünya başlamcı bulup, bütün devletler başlam bulup birlik kelip Xitayning bu qirg'inchilikni to'xtatib cho'qim insoniy turg'ida ularga bir yordam berishni umid qilaman. Men chin qalbimdan yana bir qilmishlar uchun, ochiq insonlar uchun men sizlardan yana shuni so'rayman. Rahmat.
I want to say a big thank you to you for these words. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm thankful to all of you for all that you are doing to work on this issue. I hope that you would please make our voices heard to the entire world and that you will lead the world in this. The U.S. government has a special place in my heart, and I hope that you will continue to help us. We see the U.S. government, we see the United States as very powerful in the world. And in fact, China is always saying that it is afraid of the U.S., that if it weren't for the U.S., otherwise it would be able to eat up the entire world. And I so hope that you will continue in this humanitarian way to help us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will recognize myself now for a few questions, and I want to come back to this theme of the surveillance state that a number of other members and of course the witnesses have touched on. And we've heard some stories about relatively old-fashioned surveillance, people being forced to take in informants in their homes, for example, based on just large numbers of people working for the Chinese security police. But a lot of it is quite sophisticated technologically, and I just want to maybe ask you, Mr. Turkel, to talk about the role that facial recognition technology plays in all of this. It's not just cameras; it's the software behind the cameras. Is that not right?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
this surveillance is happening both in China and here to our fellow Americans. In China, initially they started with collecting voice samples, iris scans, DNA samples to build this giant biometric data for the Uyghurs, and that paved the way for using integrated joint operating platform that Human Rights Watch documented, reverse engineered to collectively rounding up people. So now if you go to any Uyghur homes, they have a QR code on the door. So the officials can scan and find out who lives there, what kind of relatives at home in China and abroad, what kind of profession that they have, the past writings, the job history, everything, even the way that they engage in religious practice. And here at home, based on the report that UHRP published in 2019, they're using telephone messages, video chat to threaten the Uyghur Americans in homeland here. And also Darren Byler, an American scholar, went to China in 2019, came back with a bone-chilling report, reported that close to 1 million Chinese cadres have been implanted in the Uyghur homes, eating with them, sleeping with them, uninvited, and there have been also reported sexual violence against the Uyghur woman whose husband had been taken to the camps. So this has been happening.
Let me stop you there, because I want to move this along just a bit. The technology, the system, as you mentioned, is exported, and this is something that concerns all of us. It's one reason why this is a threat to the world. But the technology is imported in many cases. We know that, for example, Intel and NVIDIA chips are help to power the supercomputers that China uses to manage all this data. Oracle has provided technology to Chinese police. Hewlett-Packard owns 49% of H3C, a Chinese company that provides the switches, surveillance network, control systems to law enforcement in Xinjiang and around China. I assume you would think it would be helpful for Congress to go beyond just recommending voluntary due diligence on the part of U.S. companies, but to actually prohibit the export of technology to China that could be used in commission of these human rights abuses.
Certainly, the existing laws, existing resources are not sufficient to tackle these.
And we did, in fact, pass such legislation in the House twice last year, including as part of the National Defense Bill, which was strangely and mysteriously stripped from the final bill by the Senate Banking Committee. We're going to try to do this again.
Absolutely.
This year. I'll just end on I want to shift and then make a point about the diplomacy that's needed in the Muslim world. And I want to ask you quickly, have you seen any evidence of, for example, the Arab satellite networks running documentaries, shows, news about what's happening to the Uyghurs? Just very quickly.
I have not seen the satellite, but they have been using the diplomatic representatives in Beijing on CGTN to dissipate misinformation about.
Until that starts happening, and I give this administration credit for beginning to raise this issue globally in a way that we haven't before. But frankly, particularly in the Middle East, unless this becomes part of the priority conversation, which right now is dominated understandably by issues like Iran and recognition of Israel and the situation in Yemen and many other issues we want them to be raising with these countries. Unless my friend Brett McGurk, the coordinator for the Middle East at the NSC, puts this on his agenda when he has breakfast with the Emirati ambassador, it's just not going to change. And I think this is something that we need to be pressing with the administration as we take on this issue. My time is up. I see Representative Manning. So we'll go to you, and I see Representative Omar has joined us as well. So let's go to Representative Manning first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There have been a lot of important discussions during this hearing about the ways we can put pressure on the Chinese in an effort to change their policy, and that certainly will take a lot of time. I think it's important that we move forward on those things, but in the meanwhile, people are suffering. So I'd like to focus on how we can help people escape this desperate situation. Mr. Turkle, can you tell us, are there any countries beside the U.S. that are accepting Uyghur refugees?
Yes, Sweden and Germany. Sweden made a public statement that it will accept Uyghur refugees in the country. Germany, after making a fateful mistake, issued a statement that no Uyghur seeking asylum will be repatriated to China. But most of the Western democracies, specifically Western European countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, have been very welcoming to Uyghur refugees.
And are there any things we can do to encourage more countries to accept Uyghur refugees?
Absolutely. The Uyghurs have not been benefited from the resettlement program that we historically been engaged, practiced. So if the Uyghurs given a priority in the Biden administration's refugee resettlement program, in a significant number, we're not talking about 10, 15,000, but at least 5,000 Uyghurs who have been in hiding in the Middle Eastern countries, or in the verge of being deported to China, would be a good start. But there's something else we can do. Let's have an asylum interview arranged for asylum applicants like Tursunay Ziyaudin here. We have 4 camp survivors who are waiting for asylum hearing, asylum interviews. We're talking about asylum pending since 2018. So these kind of things can be done. So DHS can at least schedule asylum interviews for the pending affirmative asylum applicants in the United States.
Is there any way to know the number of refugees who would want to leave the country if there were places for them to go?
You mean China or?
For people Uyghurs who would like to leave China, any idea how many?
Congresswoman, ironically, in a genocidal situation, the perpetrators usually kick out the population from their ancestral homeland, whereas in China, they're preventing the Uyghurs leaving. They're starting with confiscating passports. I haven't seen my mother since my law school graduation in 2004, simply because the Chinese won't give her a passport to leave the country. So they cannot leave. But we can start with the ones who are already outside of China in Central Asia, Turkey, and other Middle Eastern countries.
Thank you for that. And I'm sorry about your personal situation. Mr. Millward, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the CCP is inflicting atrocities on a variety of non-Han peoples. Are there ethnic groups other than the Uyghurs who are experiencing repression, torture, similar to the atrocities that we're hearing about today?
Yes, we've heard examples of Kazakhs, who are, of course, another Central Asian people, but there are Kyrgyz. I've heard of a small group known as Dongxiang who are suffering from this. They are, many Muslim groups. I don't want to, in my testimony, I don't want to say it is not targeting Muslim peoples. It certainly is, but others have been pulled in as well. The Hui group, who are Chinese-speaking Muslims in China, in Xinjiang, but also outside of Xinjiang, are increasingly coming under this kind of pressure with destruction of architecture, with arrest of religious personnel, and so on. So it is a very broad problem.
Thank you. I'd like to use the rest of my time just to say to Ms. Tursinay, I want to thank you for sharing your horrifying story, because you've brought to this terrible treatment of the Uyghurs, you've brought it to life for us in a way that was so compelling that I don't think any of us who heard you today will ever be able to forget the plight of the Uyghurs and our moral obligation to work to end this genocide. So thank you very much for your courage today.
Tursunayga deydigan gepim, sizge rahmetimni bildirgim kelip atadi. Bizni intayin yaxshi bir tushunchaga ega qildingiz bugungi vaqtingiz bilan. Hech qaysimiz shu bir umr unutib qolmaymiz. Hikoyangizni unutib qolmaymiz.
Rahmat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Manning. And finally, we will go to Representative Omar.
Thank you, and I just want to thank all of our panelists for their bravery and for this great discussion. Mr. Turkle, when we were holding 22 Uyghurs at Guantanamo, none of whom had any known anti-American sentiment, you were probably the most vocal advocate for their release. We also saw in the documents leaked to the New York Times last year that one of the things President Xi said was that he wanted to emulate America's war on terror tactics. Can you tell us your perspective on the relationship between how Xi justifies the atrocities against the Uyghurs and the global phenomenon of Islamophobia?
No country treats the Muslims the way that China treats the Uyghurs around the world. I mean, arguably there are other Canada countries, but there's nothing even comparable. Islamophobia is a hallmark of their Chinese policies. And also, I have to note this. This is not the first time that I'm testifying and making this comment. I think it was a mistake for the United States government in 2002, 2003. Designating this obscure organization, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, as a terrorist organization. That paved the way for this comfortable labeling Uyghurs as a terrorist. The US State Department last year revoked that decision, but the damage is already done. Even surprisingly, in the Uyghur dictionary, the word terrorism or terrorist does not even exist. The Uyghurs probably the most pacified Muslims that you can find on the face of the earth. And yet, because of the anti-Muslim sentiment around the world and the mistakes made by some Western governments in Europe and here at home, the Chinese opportunistically using it for advancing its propaganda campaign. It's working, unfortunately.
Really appreciate that. I've been raising that concern, how war on terror has justified atrocities being committed against Muslims throughout the world. I also wanted to ask you about something I think we both find atrocious, which is the number of US companies and individuals who are profiting off of atrocities against the Uyghurs. Can you tell us about Erik Prince's contract in the Uyghur region?
This question to me, directed to me or professional?
Yes.
I was somewhat dumbfounded that Erik Prince acknowledged in his conversation with Mehdi Hasan on Al Jazeera that he is training the police academy or the police force. And now it's becoming a criminal activity because we have, as a country, added 48, the entire police department in the Uyghur region to the entity list, including this one credited in the movie Mulan for their assistance. So it's unconscionable, and this is initially started in Hong Kong, and now reportedly expanded to training police force in the Uyghur region. So this is something that Congress and law enforcement need to look into.
Really appreciate that. And I wanted to ask Ms. Sia Wudu how she would respond to people, and I know I could ask all the panelists this question, but to the people who say that, the atrocities that are being committed against the Uyghurs, it's sort of a propaganda and it doesn't really exist. It's not something that is happening. I get called out often every time I speak about the atrocities that are happening to the Uyghurs. Can you respond to those people who don't believe what happened to you is a real thing?
Tursunay ханымға сауал. Siz Uyg'urlarga ilib berilib ishlarni yolg'on deydigan odamlarga qanday deb javob berasiz? Nima deysiz? Yolg'on deb chiqsa.
Çokum o çağda bunçlar iniq paketlarni hozir bilmaydi demayman, men iniq biladi. Bizlar emas, butun dunyoda hozir bilmaydi odam qolmadi desam bo'ldi. Haqiqiy bir po'latdek paketmi bor, hozir ko'rib turib, buning ko'zini yummagan odam cho'qim Xitoy bilan yoki savdo munosabati bor, yoki Xitoyga munosabatlik bir ish qilib o'zining boshqa taraflik bir o'sh tarafini o'ylagan bir odam bo'lmasa, uningdan boshqasini hammasi buning ko'z yummaydi. Haqiqiy inson o'zining vijdoni bilan bir inson bo'lsa, yurkun tutib turib o'lsa, insonga yordam beradigan odam unda o'ylamaydi deb o'ylayman. U yerda faqat Uyg'urlar emas, Uyg'urlar o'shmanlik qilganlar desa, lekin u yerda Uyg'ur, Qozoq har qanday millatlar bo'lib musulmon dindagi millatlarning hammasi Qozoq bo'lsin, Qirg'iz bo'lsin, O'zbek bo'lsin, ashtaq millatlar bor. Hammasi bor ashlarning bir Xitoy millatidan boshqasi. Uning ichida bir Xitoy millati yo'q. Shunga bu Xitoy hukumatining maxsus ashtaq qartilgan bir kishi musulmonlar deb o'ylayman. Buning ko'z yumgan cho'qim ashtaq bir bo'lmasa, uningdan boshqa men uningga boshqa hech nima deyolmayman. Shundaqla bo'lmasa, uningdan boshqa odam ko'z yumolmaydigan darajada bu ig'ir.
There are clear facts, and it's not just us who knows this, it's everyone in the world who knows what's going on. These facts are strong like steel, and anyone who says otherwise is closing their eyes. Maybe they have some sort of relationship with China, maybe they're thinking about something else, but no one who is thinking about humanity from the perspective of a human would actually think this. This is something that's being enacted on Uyghurs, on Kazakhs, on people of all ethnic backgrounds, mostly Muslim, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, all of them, although there is not one Han person among the people being targeted in this way. And these actions are specially being taken against them. So people have closed their eyes. I can't say much other than that.
I know I'm out of time, but I wanted to say I agree, and I know that it's not comfortable being asked that question, but I think it is important that we do remind people that this is something that's real, that's happening, and that our inability to recognize and hear people who are bearing witness will allow for this atrocity to continue and this genocide to take place while the whole world watches. So thank you for your bravery, and thank you all for coming here today and shedding light into this. Really appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, it is time to close this hearing. I think often we're happy to end long hearings, but this one, I'm sure I speak for all the members, was particularly powerful and affecting for us all. I want to thank Chairman Meeks for his leadership in bringing us together today, Ranking Member McCall for his partnership with us on this issue and in the defense of human rights around the world, and of course to all of our witnesses, particularly to Tursunay. Words like genocide and crimes against humanity are very powerful, but also somewhat abstract. And what we heard today was the personification of genocide and crimes against humanity. We heard what it actually means to the people who suffer it. in the words through the voice of somebody who managed to escape, but who left behind a country, a family, people who are still suffering, which he just described. We all, I think, recognize how difficult it is to deal with human rights abuses in a country like China. It's a superpower with nuclear weapons. We faced a similar challenge with the Soviet Union for many decades, but I think we all share the view that absolutely central to our contest with the Chinese government is establishing, not just for the United States and China, but for the world, the difference between right and wrong, the difference between what is true and what is false. That's what this contest is all about. China wants to establish a new set of rules in the world. The Chinese government wants to establish a new set of rules in the world in which what we heard today is either dismissed as right or the world simply agrees not to care. And it is extraordinarily important to all of us, to all the people in the world, that the United States play its part in establishing this is wrong. So we need an international coalition to do that. We want to work as a committee, as a Congress, with the administration to build that coalition and to make sure that our government has all the legal authorities that it needs to be able to play our part in the work to come. So we're all committed to that on a bipartisan basis. We're grateful to all the witnesses for giving us the information and the inspiration we need to do our work. Thank you again so much. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Finally, here is great news for people with blood sugar issues and who want to drop those extra pounds, feel better, and have more energy. This means that finally, healthy blood sugar levels can be achieved for people who love to eat and love carbs. People are also reporting more energy and weight loss that is quicker and with less sacrifice than ever before. This natural berry discovery flies in the face of traditional medicine and what you've been told before. Yet it is proven to work by scores of people and shown effective in tests published by Current Therapies in Medicine and in Diabetes Care. This means that it is now hogwash that everyone has to do without the delicious food you love, or do without the carb and sugar foods you love in order to have healthy blood sugar levels. So if you want a solution to your blood sugar issue, please stay tuned to hear some dramatic personal stories from people like you who were in